Act. Okay, it's recording. É contigo agora, Allan.
Okay, so let me start sharing screen. I think that this is a slight improvement. Um, okay, so my name is Allan Hillani. I'm a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research. I have been on and off the meetings of this group, usually because I couldn't make on Mondays, but I have always followed the debates, have contributed here and there, and I think that this presentation, which comes from a chapter of my dissertation on Hobbes and political fetishism, was very much influenced by the work of the former STP, which is quite hard to cite properly. So not necessarily it appears in writing every time that I have the discussions that this group makes in my mind, but I think that they're always there. And if you're familiarized with them, you will hear and see some of the things that I'm trying to articulate today. So I'm very glad to present it here and to do this today. This is quite experimental, even though it's based on a chapter of my dissertation, which I already defended. So there is like some kind of, this is not complete lunacy, but at the same time, I think it's still very experimental, and I hope that it's a bit fun as well. Anyway, the idea today is to elaborate what the perspective of the state is in a perspective sense, as proposed by Eduardo Vieira de Castro, that is to articulate what kind of world appears to the state and what kind of world is produced by it. It is then an attempt to construct theoretically the state as an other subject, what I have called the problem of sovereign alterity, inspired by the work of Marshall Sahlins. And the thing is that it's too easily assumed that if the state is a product of our actions, then there is nothing autonomous about it. But as Marx has demonstrated, this is a misunderstanding of how social forms work. They have indeed a tendency to assume this autonomy or subjectivity, which is precisely the problem of fetishism. And this tendency is something that has escaped ordinary Marxist state theory or Marxist political theory, which is always obsessed with the superstructure debate, and with the noble exception, perhaps, of Kojin Karatani. And now I'm translating Karatani's book, The Structure of World History, to Portuguese. And now that I'm precisely at this moment on the chapter on the state, and it's funny to realize how big of an influence Karatani was on my thought. And we can also talk about it more specifically later because I'm not going to mention him today, even though this is kind of a series of meetings on mode B. But I won't get into details on Karatani, but I think that we can talk about it more later, and it will be interesting to do so. Okay, so I want to start with a anecdote, one from one of Viveiros de Castro's students, Joanna Miller, which is retold by him in an essay called Fear. When white people lose their ID, the police arrest them. This is an indigenous interlocutor explaining to Joanna how spirits worked in their community. So when this is an explanation. So when white people lose their ID, the police arrest them, arguing that without their identity card, they are nobody. The same happens when the spirits of the forest steal the ornaments of the Nambiquara. They hide them in holes in the forest, and the soul of the person becomes stuck in the hole as a result. The person becomes sick and no longer recognizes his or her kin. Without their ornaments, they are nobody. What called attention in this passage is how it resembles Louis Althusser's theory of interpolation. A subject becomes a subject by being interpolated by the state or another big other, but almost in inverse terms. So instead of someone becoming a subject through the interpolation, here one becomes nobody by being interpolated by spirit. More precisely, one becomes an object for another subject. This is a kind of supernatural encounter in the precise sense proposed by Vieira de Castro. Supernature does not have to do necessarily with the ethereal and invisible beings. Most importantly, it names the relational context where subject and object are not given. When one meets a spirit in the forest, for instance, the danger is to be captured by the perspective of spirits, to lose one's humanity. As Vieira de Castro puts it, he or she who responds to a you spoken by a non-human accepts the condition of being its second person. And when assuming in his turn or her turn, the position of I, does so already as a non-human. So the outcome is then the submission to the reality of another, to be captured within another's perspective, something that in the Amerindian context always takes the form of predation, that is, of becoming an object prey to a subject predator. My suggestion here is that the state can be interpreted as a predatorial spirit in this precise sense. To correct Althusser's hypotheses, to be interpolated by the state is to be captured by its point of view, to have one's status as subject turn into that of an object for the state. And I propose that we find this idea in Thomas Hobbes' political thought, more specifically in the famous frontispiece of Leviathan. It is worth recalling that Hobbes is the central figure in Karatani's account of Mode B. As I mentioned, this is a series of meetings dedicated to discussing this concept, and that a dedicated analysis of his theory might prove, of Hobbes' theory, might prove worthy of our time then. Okay. So it is not by chance that the frontispiece of Leviathan is one of the most scrutinized and replicated images of philosophical thought. Hobbes was interested in optics and visual representation, so every detail in the image matters. The frontispiece is a visualization of the book's arguments, like many other books of its period, but it is so oddly breaking from it represents the argument oddly breaking from the tradition. For example, it does not follow the convention of placing the perspectival vanishing point in the center of the image. The title of the book is not in the center of the cover. There are no figures around. There are no like statue-like figures surrounding the title. It doesn't follow the same kind of rules. The frontispiece has been endlessly interpreted, but there is a central feature of the image that usually does not receive much attention, and it's a quite obvious one, that the colossal figure stares directly at the reader. Its austere gaze follows you no matter what the position from which you look at it, contrasting with the army of tiny figures that compose its body, all with their backs facing the reader and looking at the figure's head, the only part of its body that is not composed by them. The contrast is clearly intentional. The reader is supposed to identify with all the back-facing bodies and recognize their own role in establishing the sovereign authority that characterizes the state, which, on the other hand, given its alterity, stares back to the reader as one of its subjects. That this is relevant is shown by another version of the frontispiece, one present in a manuscript sent by Hobbes to Charles II, his former pupil and future King of England. In both versions, the subject's faces are supposed to be looking at the sovereign. In the published version, they produce an identification between the subjects and the reader, both looking up, but in Charles' version, they look at the king-to-be, the reader, who finds his position mirrored in the Colossus's gaze. What the frontispiece visually represents, then, is the combination of political unity and sovereign authority, the many turn into one by means of the two, in a kind of perspectival encounter with the state itself. This process of identification through sovereign authority that the frontispiece aims to produce in the reader justifies its visual intricacy. The colossal figure is different from a mere allegorical representation of sovereignty or the state. Hobbes seems to appeal to a more abstract metaphor of how the state is constituted, emphasizing both its colossal size and its composite characters. More than that, what is at stake in representing the state in such an intricate way is the role of perspective itself. So let's talk about perspective then. Renaissance perspective theory, codified by the Italian architect Leon Battista Alberti, poses an identity between optics and geometry, with the assumption that what one sees is practically identical to the geometrical procedures that represent it in a two-dimensional plane. The technique involves imagining a line running from the eye of a hypothetical beholder to a central vanishing point, where the imaginary cone of lines projected from the eye onto the screen, a presentation of the field of vision, can be perfectly reproduced in the screen itself by taking the vanishing point as a reference. Perspective painting can only work by a suspension of two different forms of seeing. When one sees a painting, one that is made in this classical way, one sees simultaneously the colors and shapes on canvas and the thing it is supposed to represent in quite a realistic way. But you're not supposed to realize that there is a double scene involved. This, of course, is not exclusive of painting. The same duality happens in more traditional forms of theater or literature, for instance. But this duality is marked by a metaphorical structure. But we need to realize that this duality is marked by this metaphorical structure where the similar and the different, the real and the fictional are kept in tension, requiring from the spectator the ability to entertain different points of view simultaneously in order to understand what is taking place, although they do it without realizing. Yet, what seems to be defining of linear perspective, a typically European form of visual technique, by the way, is that in it, to cite John Berger, the visible world is arranged for the spectator as the universe was once thought to be arranged for God. It assumes a potentially all-encompassing gaze on the world, point of view that could only pertain to God himself, but that nonetheless has been transposed to the modern transcendental subject. Something that Donna Haraway has called a God trick, the posing of a disembodied view that is at the basis of modern Western notions of subjectivity and objectivity. So perspectival art represents then a whole Western theory of perspective, one that in which perspective is inherently disembodied, ultimately non-reciprocal, and potentially abstractable, mimicking the supposed perspective of God himself. What is crucial in the critique of the God trick of Western perspective, however, is the ultimate impossibility of such a God viewpoint, an impossibility that is concealed by the illusory effect of something like linear perspective in painting. This is interestingly corroborated by Randolph Starr's analysis of Renaissance art. It takes as a case study the frescoes of Andrea Mantegna displayed in the Camera degli Sposi of the Ducal Palace of Mantua in Italy. One of the details that he calls attention to is that the oculus, this is like a dome on the top of the room, painted in the ceiling of the room, where one can see three girls peering over the rim of the dome and looking directly at the observer. These peripheral figures who look back at the viewer are a common trope in Renaissance painting, an artifice to enhance the reality effect of the representation. But more than realism, the presence of the three girls exemplifies how perspectival representations solicit a response from the viewer, a form of including the viewer's own perspective in the painting in a way that might not coincide with the abstract point of view of linear perspective. As Starn points out, by moving our sight away from the girls and scanning the rest of the room, recall that this is but the dome of the room, we see ourselves trapped in the strict visual discipline of linear perspective painting, where the world appears as mastered by the beholder in proportion to the beholder's eye. The bearing of visual reciprocity under the perspectival structure of the room is an interesting detail, given that in the case of Hobbes' frontispiece, things are inverted. The sovereign gaze of the colossus, although also decentralized in relation to the rest of the image, is in a prominent position. It is as if the intention is not to hide the perspectival illusion, but to make it explicit. This is consistent with Hobbes' own distinction between representations that conceal their representational character and want to pass off as real presences, and representations that openly call attention to their representational character, revealing the artifice on which they rely and soliciting the cooperation from the viewer. It is this second kind of representation that is operative in the frontispiece, given that the composite and artificial character of the monstrous representation of the state aims precisely to make the reader identify with its constitution. If the first kind of representation, the one that distinguishes its representational character, the one that disguises its representational character, seems to be inherent to linear perspective, as we saw, we must find the representational artifice employed in the frontispiece in another kind of perspectives, as Hobbes calls it. This other kind of perspective is not his invention. As Noel Malcolm, who's a famous Hobbes scholar, and others as well have shown, Hobbes took the idea of this other perspective from an optical apparatus made by Jean-François Nisseron, author of La Perspective Curieuse, the Curious Perspective, a work that explores a different usage of perspective methods called anamorphosis. Anamorphosis involves the depiction of a seemingly distorted image that, when seen from an unusual viewpoint or with the aid of a device, exhibits a normal image. The most famous case of anamorphic art is Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors from 1533, which depicts a distorted skull in the bottom of the painting that can only be seen by looking at the painting from a very specific position. In the 17th century, theorists would distinguish these cases of optic anamorphosis from another kind called catoptric or dioptric anamorphosis, which made use of mirror or lens devices to produce the anamorphic effect. Hobbes mentions one of such dioptric devices in a celebratory commentary of Sir William Davenant's book Godebert, where he talks about a curious kind of perspective, where he that looks through a short hollow pipe upon a picture containing diverse figures sees none of those that are there painted, but some one person made up of their parts, conveyed to the eye by the artificial cutting of a glass. Hobbes probably has in mind one of Nisseron's devices displayed in Paris that he probably had the opportunity to see during his exile in French territory. So the mechanism involved an optical tube, like a lunette, for instance, with a polygonal lens facing a canvas containing a number of portraits of Ottoman sultans. When you looked through the tube, however, the kaleidoscopic lens would turn the faces of the sultans in a single image of Louis XIII, which Nisseron claimed was a representation of the sultan's submission to the French king. The idea of many figures composing into a single sovereign image recalls the frontispiece of Leviathan, of course, but I believe that what might have called Hobbes' attention in Nisseron's device is the fact that the unitary image of the king would only appear through an optical apparatus. So if anamorphosis can only be fully appreciated through a shift in perspective, the specific case of dioptric anamorphosis mediated by an apparatus, entails a forced correction of perspective using a specifically crafted artifice that makes the viewer see the intended image. The centrality of the apparatus puts in question the shop-worn analogy between politics and theater in the literature in Hobbes' thought. In theater, the audience is asked to entertain simultaneously two points of view, as I said, one involving fictional characters and another involving real actors. But in anamorphosis, it is impossible to entertain both viewpoints at the same time. Either one needs to change position to see another image, as in Holbein's skull, or one needs to look into the device and see another image resulting from the anamorphic effect, as in the case of the French king. In either case, it is not simply a matter of double seeing, as was the case with linear perspective, but something much closer to a perspectival shift, one that involves a different position, quite literally. We find not in theater the perfect analogy to the aesthetic political effects of anamorphosis, but in cinema. One could recall here Laura Mulvey's famous analysis of the male gaze in film, for instance. Mulvey's argument is that the archetypical erotic relationship between a male subject and a female object of desire is transposed to the objective experience of cinematic visual pleasure, often involving a male protagonist and his female romantic interest. The position of the female character as an erotic object for the male protagonist is transposed into the objective relation between a spectator and actors, object of a voyeuristic desire. reproducing the same male gaze from the screen outside of it. So independently from their gender, the spectator then is made to identify not only with the protagonist, but also with the male perspective inscribed in the camera itself. What is crucial here is the objective identification of the viewer's gaze that the camera is able to produce. The point of view of the camera necessarily intermediates the point of view of the spectator. More than that, it shapes the point of view of the spectator and makes him or her see only what the camera shows and how it shows it. Different from theater, for instance, where even the place where one is sitting can affect the spectacle. The colossal figure of Leviathan is not like an actor breaking the fourth wall on the stage. It's more as if we could see the camera itself looking back at us. The composed mass of discrete individuals quietly gazing up towards a mask that does not return their gaze resembles much more an audience facing the massive screens on IMAX movie theaters than the one that filled up Shakespeare's Globe. The relation between political actor and political audience is never conducted directly. It is always and foremost performed to the state apparatus itself, which mediates their relation and corrects the only legitimate viewpoint. In this sense, the very structure of the state seems to already contain disciplining and passivization of the spectator, a process that characterizes the development of modern visuality. But both in art and politics, such passivization is never the whole story. The cooperation of the audience is always enlisted in order for the representation to work, not to mention the cooperation of actors, directors, editors, and all crew members that are necessary for a film to be produced. If Cicero's device represented the submission of the subject to the king, it also implied that there would be no king without the subjects. In fact, although the multiple objects are subordinate to the unified image and only gain their real meaning by being subsumed under it, they are, in a sense, more real than their unitary effect, which only appears through a shift in perspective. Similarly, despite its massive size, the giant in the frontispiece can only sustain its equally massive sword and crest by means of the tiny figures that compose its arms and torso. And yet, instead of simply deconstructing the role of the state, Hobbes' representation simultaneously affirms it. What the book as a whole, and the frontispiece in specific, makes the reader see is precisely how the state can be composed of the multitude and still present itself as an independent and massively powerful entity. It represents the subjects as both matter and artificers of the commonwealth, and as subjects to its enormous power. The subjects are placed both inside the state as constitutive parts of it and outside of it, standing in awe in face of its massive power. Hobbes' frontispiece then uses the mechanisms of anamorphosis to produce a specific political effect. It allows the subjects to see themselves as constituting the state by enacting a certain perspectival shift that allows the subjects to assume materially a new perspective. This is the perspective of the state itself, the apparatus through which the many can be seen and see themselves as one and as many. We now turn our attention to the material effects of such perspective of the state. As I proposed, the frontispiece of Leviathan fulfills a double task. On the one hand, it offers a view of the state, a representation of the state apparatus through which the multitude is united under a common power. But it also represents the point of view of the state, an articulation of how the state sees its subjects, and in doing so makes them its subjects. In the first place, this entails not only recognizing how the state's point of view on the world is situated, but also, and perhaps more crucially, understanding the kind of materialization it produces in the process. James Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, offers a first step in this investigation. For Scott, state formations are defined by the attempt to make the world legible. As Scott notes, many of the categories we take for granted in the way we apprehend the world originated in the state project of standardization and legibility. Scientific forestry, taxation systems, measurement standards, urban planning, national census, cadastral surveys, identification numbers, birth and death certificates, official languages, even last names and precise addresses are all examples discussed by Scott of how states turn exceptionally complex local realities into something legible and consequently controllable to a centralized power. For Scott, This project of making the world more legible is defined by what he called state simplifications. All the examples previously cited, from property systems and cadastral surveys to register last names and official addresses, are ways through which official bodies are able to reduce the detailed complexity of social and natural life into schematic categories. To call them simplifications can be misleading. Some are very complicated indeed, but the term is justified for its emphasis on how ignoring and collapsing distinctions that might otherwise be relevant is necessary in order to acquire a synoptic view on the matter at hand, resulting in a specific kind of knowledge. For instance, when we compare knowledge that a local farmer or a wild animal might have of a specific terrain and what a state official might learn by looking at the available data on the same terrain, it is undeniable that the abstract knowledge of the official will grasp things that concrete knowledge will never be able to attain, even though the opposite is also true. But the danger of state simplification lies not in its abstract character, but in the state's capacity to enforce them through violent means. The combination between simplification and violence defines what David Graeber calls structural stupidity, one of the cornerstones of modern bureaucracy. Structural stupidity is not simply a matter of bureaucracies being defined by stupid rules, even though that is usually the case, but rather that the stupid forms of organizing society can be sustained and managed by seemingly neutral rules. For Graeber, that violence can back up social stupidity in the form of arbitrary rules has to do with violence's capacity to interdict any debate and negotiation that might be necessary in a more egalitarian context, where the use of violence is appropriate. For example, if we disagree about the flavor of pizza we are ordering, we will need to find a solution that does not involve beating each other up. But if you miss an official deadline by an hour, or in some cases a single minute, someone might always tell you that there is nothing to be done and shut off any further discussion. This is because they act under the threat of state violence, in case you decide to not accept it so easily. Violence is then a form of avoiding what Graeber calls interpretive labor, namely the work involved in deciphering other people's motives and perceptions. The dangerous combination of schematization and state violence allows us to perceive that legibility is not simply a cognitive-like process, where reality is systematized in schematic ways. It is instead a form of turning reality into something schematic. As Scott shows, the imposition of legible systems transform the practices it regulated in order to make them align more closely to the schema. For instance, the employment of forestry signs resulted not only in a schematic rendering of the wild forest, but most importantly in a transformation of the chaotic old-growth natural formation into a new, more uniform one. Similarly, the organization of property systems entailed not only a better and more organized assessment of property rights, but a change in how property itself was organized, now reduced to an individualized and freely transferable title. These forms of state simplification are not simply an instrument to make measuring possible, enabling those who govern to know the governed. They are forms of restructuring social and natural reality so that it fits more perfectly the state schema of it. The schematic representation the state makes of reality resembles what Friedrich Jameson called cognitive mapping, but with an interesting inversion. Jameson's notion is inspired by the urban planner Kevin Lynch, who proposes that a well-planned city should be legible to its inhabitants and visitors. Jameson adds an Althusserian twist to the idea, arguing that such representation will inevitably be an imaginary representation of the subject's relationship with his or her real conditions of existence, where there is always a gap between phenomenological experience and social structure. The virtue of such cognitive mapping, however, is not to perfectly reproduce reality, but to map the social totality in ways where action can be better directed. But in Scott's account of state mapping, it is the state and not the citizen who's mapping out reality. By forcing an abstract character or complex relations, reality becomes more legible to the state itself, and only secondarily to its citizens. In representing reality through simplified schemas, the state produces a reality of its own. It makes the territory increasingly like the map, to make reference to a common phrase of Gregory Bateson. An interesting effect of the schematization of reality enacted by the state is precisely that the abstract and universal character of state simplifications always entails an external point of view of the governed reality. In order to rule large-scale societies and territories, state officials are many steps removed from society, and often state officials are many steps removed from the society and territory they govern, and are only able to see the human activities of interest through the simplified approximations of documents and statistics. This is the case even of a local government in a modern city, but in the past, it would involve literally sending officials to different parts of the country to exercise state authority. In such cases, the fact that local idiosyncratic rules were perfectly legible for those who operated on it on a daily basis was irrelevant, for this wouldn't be the case for the state official. But by making the local reality legible to the state, it also makes it legible for potentially anyone. This is perfectly exemplified by something seemingly innocent like street names, house numbers, or subway maps in modern cities. The medieval city was completely illegible to a stranger or trader arriving for the first time. They wouldn't be able to find anything without local help. On the other hand, someone can travel today to a city like New York or Rio de Janeiro, even without knowing English or Portuguese, and figure out how to navigate through the subway system. Although the subway of these two specific cities might be hard cases for the inexperienced. In any case, what is crucial is that the state's point of view must be recognized as both a generic point of view and as the point of view of an other, often in a literal sense, given how external and internal colonization played a crucial role in modern statecraft. Everywhere the state establishes itself, it must turn its external point of view into a seemingly neutral standpoint, a point of view overlooking all points of view, as Pierre Bourdieu puts it. That is, something which appears as no longer a point of view, since it is in relation to it that all points of view are organized. By working as an overseer of political disputes and the corresponding struggle between points of view, the state removes itself from such dispute as a neutral arbiter, a kind of divinization effect resulting in the belief that the state is not itself one among other points of view. But that does not mean that we must fall into the trap of taking for granted the state's perspective as the only one possible. After all, it is just one perspective among others that are always threatening its all-encompassing jurisdiction. This threat can take the shape of conspiracy theories that subvert any kind of communicative reason in Western democracies, or the radical disagreement that a native nation can have on where the border of a state really is, or what kind of entities really live in it. In any case, recognizing the state as precisely a point of view, that is, by having a point of view on the state outside of the state itself, allows us to have a better understanding of the artificial reality it constructs. Like the God eye view, we must also situate the perspective of the state, to recover a term by Donna Haraway, inscribe the state within the political relations that constitute it, instead of taking it as a transcendental condition for them. I could conclude here, but if I have more time, I would like to explore a little further a few consequences of all I just said. It has to do with the fact that the other, who the state is, nonetheless is a product of its subject's actions, the problem of what I call state fetishism. Things are going to get a bit more abstract and a bit more complex, but bear with me. So do I have time? It's 5:50 already, and I have some 9 pages more if we have time to go over.
I think it's
Gabriel?
fine.
Okay. So let's move to the final section then. Just a second, but I messed up this. Okay, so one curious aspect of Hobbes' state theory is that the state is defined by him as a person. I can't go into detail on how he articulates this idea and all the paradoxes that it entails, nor can I reconstruct my own interpretation of it. I would just summarize the point and claim that, in my view, the state is a person that emerges through both a process of composite unification, the multitude as one, and as an equivocal object of a relation of differentiation, the dual opposition of sovereign and people. What this understanding allows us to see is that the state does not emerge out of a supposedly non-relational context, as the so-called state of nature is usually interpreted. Rather, the state emerges out of the intertwinement of specific forms of a specific form of political sociality. Actually, the intertwinement of two specific forms of political sociality, but I will get there. As it is widely known, Hobbes proposes that the context from which the state emerges is a natural condition defined by state of perpetual warfare. Again, I can't go into details and I can't demonstrate how this is a misreading of what Hobbes is saying, but I will say that this natural condition, or so-called state of nature, is a political condition without the state, one that is inherently political in its nature, that is defined by uncertainty and contingency, and that the rules governing it still applies after states are instituted. Also, the idea that warfare can itself be a principle of sociality is found in the literature on indigenous societies since the work of Pierre Clastres. What I think can be done is then to kind of apply the theory used to explain the so-called societies against the state to understand societies with states, like ours. For starters, this would entail rethinking what society itself means and how it is a modern construct that cannot be found in all forms of human association. Hence the coinage of the term sociality by Merriam Strathern. Strathern develops the notion of sociality in the Gender of the Gift, where she analyzed gender relations in Melanesia, a place where all social relations are understood in gender terms. Strathern argues against the idea that gender relations in indigenous societies, and Melanesia in specific, could be an equivalent to class domination in modern societies, a common thesis among Marxist anthropologists of the 70s and 80s. As she shows for the Melanesian case, gender relations between men and women take the form of complementarity and reciprocal elicitation rather than hierarchy. But that does not mean that there is no kind of domination between them. Her point is that the domination is only one aspect of the relation, one that is inseparable from its complementarity. I think something similar happens in the relation between sovereign and people, although the problem seems to be inverted. In Melanesia, the question is how domination appears despite the complementarity between genders. In modernity, it is how complementarity between sovereign and people appears despite the domination that exists between them. The question then is whether we can find an alternative model of reciprocity with which we can, if we can find an alternative model of reciprocity with which we can conceptualize our own political relations. This brings us to Strathern's notion of sociality. The notion opposes the Western understanding of personhood as individual entities that pre-exist the multiple relations in which they The notion of sociality opposes the Western understanding of personhood as individual entities that pre-exist the multiple relations in which they take part in society. Instead, she argues a Melanesian person is not understood as pre-existing anything, but as an enactment of relations that they actualize and transform into other relations. Relations are not a matter of individual choice, but the substrate from which persons are formed, the context in which they act, and the very reason for their existence. This means that in the exchange relation between two partners, their persons do not pre-exist their exchange. Rather, their persons as receiver or giver are produced in that context out of the relation they reenact, which on the one hand already existed from prior debts and exchanges, and on the other will create a reciprocal action in the future, involving other objects that are themselves products of other relations, and so on. Take, for example, the most common example in Melanesian ethnography, the ceremonial gift of pigs between clans. The image and the schemas here are from Alfred Gell's marvelous text, Strathernograms, which is the only way to make sense of Strathern's book, The Gender of the Gift, in my opinion. If we apply a Strathernian, that is a Melanesian, lens to what we see at the moment of exchange, we will not perceive two pre-existing people handing a clearly determined object. What appeared in this case is only a slice of an ongoing series of relations that go well beyond the duration of the ceremony, relations that are not external to the persons and things involved. There is a series of relations that are conditional for the exchange event. Pigs are raised by wives, although they are exchanged by the husbands. Pigs are the result of reproduction between male and female pigs. Exchange partners are chosen due to reciprocal ties. The man exchanging the pig acts in the name of the whole clan, etc. And the pig objectifies not only the relations through which it was produced, but also the relations that are established through its own exchange, such as the duty to reciprocate. Through the specific aesthetic of an object being detached, a whole series of relations are also being eclipsed. But that does not make the relations disappear. In fact, exchange is done only with the intention of furthering and accumulating more relations. Relations are the condition, means, and goal of all actions. It is not by chance, then, that Strathern sees in this paradigmatic case of exchange a form of perspectivism. As she describes it, Melanesian gift exchange is not so much an exchange of objects, but an exchange of perspectives that involves the production and preservation of a relation of difference. There is then a double aspect of sociality that is crucial to it. Following Melanesian conceptions, Strathern sees sociality as both composite and individual. A person exists either as the result of multiple relations that compose them, or as one term in a dual relation, as in the case of exchange partners or gender relations. The former is crucial for the discussion of the state because it allows us to understand how one individual person and a collective person can be homologous. Strathern's words, the bringing together of many persons is just like the bringing together of one. The unity of a number of persons conceptualized as a group or set is achieved through eliminating what differentiates them. And this is exactly what happens when a person is also individualized. The causes of internal differentiation are suppressed or discarded. Indeed, the one holistic condition may elicit the other. Thus, a group of men or a group of women will conceive of their individual members as replicating in a singular form, one man, one woman, what they have created in collective form, one man's house, one matrilineage. In other words, a plurality of individuals as individuals, many is equal to their unity, one. But, as Strathern also notes, this suppression of internal differentiation so that a unity can appear takes a specific dual form. When a singular or a collective person faces another, their relation is not always subsumed under a further collectivity. This brings us to the second aspect of Strathern's person, its individuality. It is in the perspectival encounter of the agent with an other person, a necessarily dual structure, that the multiple relations that constitute one's person can appear to that other as a unity. The composite and the dual correspond to two forms of sociality through which a unitary agent, either collective or particular, can then emerge. In the first case, unity is achieved by eclipsing or encompassing multiplicity, whereas in the second, it is achieved through the detachment of one half of a paired relation. Sociality, then, is a concept that allows us to understand conflict and differentiation not as the opposite of collective association, but as a fundamental aspect of it. We might ask then what would happen if we try to understand state formation in terms of sociality. A possible line of argument is suggested by Simon Harrison's analysis of the male cult among the Abatip of the Sepik River region, another Melanesian case. As he argues, when warfare is at the center of the relation between genders, we can see how the privileged position of men, which allows them to symbolize the collectivity encompassing men and women as being male, is justified on the basis of their role as protectors of the collectivity in general and of their women in specific. So even when there is no actual war, the threat of war works as a way to portray anything outside of the group as inherently hostile. However, as Harrison also shows, the idea that men are defenders of the community allows for men to equate themselves with the community and act as defenders of men against even women, who are then classified as outsiders rather than insiders, and can in fact be associated symbolically with enemies. In this case, instead of defending the community, including men and women, from external enemies, men defend themselves from enemies which include women. Yet, in doing so, men also remove themselves from the community, allowing the symbolization of them as external enemies from the standpoint of women. So, inspired by Harrison, we can schematize the same possibilities in the case of the state. This schema is useful in showing that at the heart of the unity of the state against external enemies lies an internal relation of potential enmity between sovereign and people. When war is the form of exchange in question, we can understand how the relations between genders can not only take the form of domination, but also provide a framework to explain political relations in terms of domination, especially the one between sovereign and people. Because the state is an equivocal object like the community, including men and women, the sovereign as state can claim to protect the people from the dangers of outside and identify the people itself with those enemies, thereby putting the sovereign itself, in the position of potential enemy from the people's standpoint. That is, in the case of the people as state. This model can help us to apply Strathern's model of sociality to the state in order to understand the specific kind of political sociality that makes it possible. For Strathern, as I mentioned, when persons are taken in their internally composite aspect, they achieve a unity through the eclipsing of such multiplicity. But that unity is achieved in the context of external dual relations, such as in the cases of exchange with a specific social other, the encounter with another group, or an exchange partner, for instance. On the other hand, when persons are taken as internally form of one of a pair through the detachment of one half of their individual constitution. But that other kind of unity is achieved in the context of external multiple relations that the person objectifies, including other halves from which one differentiates itself. In The Gender of the Gift, Strathern proposes a diagram to schematize a relation between two modes of sociality that I have adapted to elucidate in visual terms my own argument. What it tries to show is how the two kinds of political sociality identified by Strathern overlap with the two kinds of sociality through which states are formed, which I have called kratic sociality and archic sociality. I call the first kratic sociality due to how power or force, from the Greek kratos, is the central relation involved in such unification. And I call the second archic sociality due to how the possibility of being under someone else's rule, from the Greek arche, which means both principle or rule, is the central problem in political exchange. Kratic sociality is characterized by internal composition, the multiplicity of the multitude, and external duality, state-state or subject-subject relations. Whereas archic sociality is characterized by internal duality, master-subject, ruler-rule relations, and external composition, the network of power relations in which one finds oneself. Exchange relations and power relations between subject and states are given as in Hobbes' natural condition. That is, they are the relational context in which eclipsing into a unity or detaching one of a pair takes place. And each exchange relations and power relations is the context for the kind of sociality that characterizes the other. External power relations being the context for the emergence of the sovereign in relation to the people, external political exchanges being the context for the emergence of the person of the state or the person of the individual in unitary form. This intertwinement is relevant to show that the two kinds of sociality are never separate. They are like two sides of a Mobius strip, one inevitably arriving at the other in a continual process. As Strathern puts it, the two types of sociality exist as alternative forms to each other because each anticipates the other. This is because the two kinds of sociality are just a form of schematizing the same process, in this case, the emergence of the state and its continual reproduction through the actions of its members in relation to the actions of others. One could imagine, for instance, a continuous line is starting from one place and passing through all other terms of the schema. Say we start with the multitude, which is eclipsed into the collective unit of the state, which only emerges through an external dual relation with the sovereign, which we could interpret in terms of an exchange, revealing how internally the state is divided into rulers and ruled, that through the action of the social contract take the complementary form of sovereign and people, which can only emerge through the encompassment of power of the multitude, and so on. It is because multitudes are faced with an other that their unity can be achieved. Recall that even the sovereign is an other of this kind, but that other can be an enemy group, but that other can also be an enemy group justifying unification under a common power. Such unity involves the encompassment of the power of all, which eclipses their multiple character. But because power relations are never static and are always up to contestation, they provide the context in which the precarious relation of sovereignty is sustained. The opposition between sovereign and people then reveals that the sovereign can only appear above the people through its own detachment, the consolidation of a function that, in fact, is present in each and every one, the possibility of ruling oneself and others. As we know, at least since Aristotle, the ability to truly rule politically is inseparable from the possibility of being ruled. The institution of a sovereign entity responsible for commanding and not obeying is grounded in the silent presupposition that everyone potentially can be a ruler in order to become part of the ruled who are supposed to obey. Consequently, the possibility of subverting the relation of rule established between sovereign and people appears more clearly in the encounter with another who is able to question that relation, say, for instance, a foreign conqueror or a revolutionary party, both necessarily coming from a place that is external to the state itself, which in turn take the form of a power dispute. It is interesting that each sociality can only appear from the standpoint produced by the other, the role of sovereignty only being seen in its relational constitution through the standpoint that takes power relations for granted, and the unification of a common power only being seen in its relational constitution in reference to a sovereign other. But more than that, we can also see how one sociality controls the other, regulating its circular structure, not so different to how different schismogenic processes, to use another of Bateson's terms, can control each other. Cratic sociality, the fact that sovereign power must encompass the power of the multitude, becomes a problem if sovereignty becomes too detached, collapsing the power compositions that sustains it. In a similar vein, archic sociality, the differentiation between ruler and ruled, always drives a political community to their institutionalization into a common power. Otherwise, it cannot sustain itself. Even when charismatic leaders are able to encompass the power of many, they always face the problem of the routinization of their charisma, as Weber knew well. Thus, through this interpretation, the so-called passage of the state of nature to the commonwealth acquires a completely different meaning. That passage, which as we know never properly happens, marks simply the process of unification of the state in two different forms. The state as a composite entity and as the objectification of a dual internal relation to it, namely the relation between sovereign and state and the people as state. This process of unification is always precarious and up for contestation due to the very nature of the political relations through which it is constituted. I propose that we could define what I call state fetishism as precisely the removal of that unitary effect in its double aspect out of the relations through which it is constituted, so that the person of the state can acquire its monstrous character despite being ultimately the result of our own actions, even though, and precisely because, we are not fully in control of them. Okay, so that was it. I think that the last part might have been too much, but I always wanted to present on these two schemas, so I finally had the chance and had a group of people that are not graphophobic. So yeah, I hope that it made at least a little bit of sense, or we can focus on the first part as well, if you want.
I'm really glad you completed it because that last bit really tied it in super nicely with a lot of the other stuff we've been talking about. So thank you for completing it. It was really amazing.
Cool.
Shall we make our usual break and then go into discussion?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So 5 minutes. Great.
So we see each other at 15. I wonder, Alan, if we um should start from these diagrams again, because like several people have been excited, but on the other hand, I'm not sure like if we had the time to really get them. So maybe a possible start would be like that you kind of like walk us through the diagrams again in order to like properly understand them. But we could also like start with questions. I don't know if that makes
Yeah, I
more
mean,
sense. That's
I'm
that's
fine
up to
with
you, Alan, probably.
I'm fine with both. I mean, like these diagrams, they're not mine. I kind of like adapted them from Simon Harrison and Merlin Strathern, which are both like two anthropologists that work on the same region of the world, kind of are speaking the same language. So I think that they kind of they go together well, and they help me to understand what I've been calling, what I want to call like these socialities that create the state. Like if you can understand the state in terms of sociality. So, I mean, I can go over the diagrams, but I think that the crux here is to, so start with the three circles down. These are three different ways of understanding the relation between sovereign people, enemy, which is being homologous to the relation between men, women, enemy. So if you're taking enmity at the center of your analysis, or if you're taking enmity in what is that you are looking at, on the first moment, it seems that men, since they represent the clan, since they represent the group, they speak in the name of the whole, including men and women, that they identify themselves with the state, or they identify themselves with the community, and oppose the community to the enemy. But because they are able to identify themselves with the community, that means that they are able to identify them, particularly men, against women, and put the place of the community on their side. And because they can do that, the inverse can also be done. So if we change men, women, enemy to sovereign people, enemy, we have a situation in which on the one, you can see the cursor of, or not, or so you have like this situation in which you have the community, which would be like the people and the sovereign, against the enemy, which is outside. And this produces this square right here, where the sovereign and the state and the people as the state are coinciding. They are the same situation. But this one can also, it can produce two different situations. One in which the people is identified with the state and the sovereign is identified with the enemy. So the people, so you have like this losange here, the people as the state and the people against the sovereign as enemy. And or this other option here, which is the sovereign identifying with the state and equating the people with the enemy. So the sovereign as the state against the people as enemy. So this is just this is a way to understand this complex, what Saussure calls fractal structure of sociality, which means that one is always many, and it's not that you have like individual discrete entities that are building up into a collective entity. The collective entity is also like an individual. So if you look at the larger scale, you see the same structure than this of the small one. This is something that is present in the cosmology of Melanesia, but it's also like a feature that appears in the theories of these Melanesianists. So this idea is interesting because it allows us to see how we imagine a king. How can like in Kantorovic's Two Bodies of the King, how can a king be identified with the state as a whole? So you have one single person, but you also have like one single community, and those two things are identified, but those two things are also clearly separate. And this is a way to try to understand how that can be the case. And more than that is a way to understand how this combination of people into the state can also be permeated by conflict, war, and violence, which is also paradoxical because if you take for granted that the state emerges as this kind of like social contract or something between people, it is a form of ending conflict or ending warfare or ending violence, but that is also absurd because that can only take place through the enactment of violence and through the enactment of violence by means of the state, which is monopolizing violence as like legitimate coercion or something. So this is what is kind of behind this other diagram, which is an adaptation from Strathern's book, The Gender of the Gift. So Strathern is trying to show how there are two different socialities, one that she calls domestic and one that she calls political. I didn't mention this because I think that it's confusing because I'm saying that both of them are political. But in her sense, political means, like relation between men as representatives of their clans with other men as representatives of their clans, like in this situation here. So what you have here is not just like two men, you have like the husband, which has a relation with the wife, whose relation is being objectified in the pig, which is encompassing everything in their own person in the moment of their exchange and becoming, like one single large person through that process. So the domestic sociality is one that is marked by this complementarity between genders, and the political sociality is one that is marked by the equality or not necessarily equality, but equivalence between the exchanging partners. They matter, their difference matter in the sense that one is giving and the other one is receiving, but both of them are men in this sense. Or both of them are women. That it's not necessarily, it's just that in Melanesia, usually men are representing the whole group, but there are some cases of women groups, etc. Like these are details that are irrelevant for what I'm trying to say. What I try to articulate then are two kind of political socialities, one that is built or one that is concerned with power relations and how power relations, which is inherently multiple, can be unified into a common power, and ruling relations or the relation of sovereignty, which is the one that separates between sovereign and people. Because part of the argument is that on the one hand, you have like this many becoming one, but that can only happen because of a dual relation between people and sovereign. So even when small group of people decides we are going to become a group, that can only take place by creating this other thing, which is the group, which now takes a kind of personified structure because and it becomes like a person in its own sense. And it starts to have a will, which is like the collective will of that group. It starts to have some rules. And if that doesn't have enough strength, then the group itself dissolves because then it doesn't hold up as a group. So I think that is the mystery that I'm trying to articulate here, and that I think that Hobbes is kind of useful. So in this graph here, we have like the two kinds of sociality. And the thing about these two kinds of sociality is that both of them have this kind of like fourfold possibility. So either have internal relations or have external relations, either have composite relations or have dual relations. Composite relations have to do with that composite sociality, the fact that many turning into one, which is then many, and that is one, etc. So you have like that kind of line. And dual relations is always like men, women, giver, receiver, or like parents, children. You have like this kind of complementarity involved. And external, internal have to do with the position of the person, so outside of the person or inside the person. When understanding things in terms of power, Socratic sociality, the relations that are at stake are the internal composition of that common power, so the multitude, and the external duality between that group and other groups. Or if you're talking about individual power, between my power and your power. So this is the kind of duality that is relevant here. So it is this duality, this my power, your power, like we don't know who has more power in this situation right here, that is the context for a unification. So, like imagine that I have, I have a weapon with me, or that I'm pretty famous, or that I have like, someone backing me up. It is because of our encounter that you can kind of like project what it is that I am eclipsing, what it is that I am holding together within me. And that is a kind of unification in my person of several other persons. So this is the process of eclipsing. So it eclipses because I am here and there is nothing happening. Like it's like in this situation, you only have this guy, but that guy is eclipsing several other things. So eclipsing several other relations and several other people as well. But what is just taken for granted is that moment of encounter. With archaic sociality, it's kind of the inverse. So what happens, what is central here is the internal duality. So that there's this whole theory of gender that you find in Melanesia, which is, gender is not intrinsic. Kind of everything in Melanesia is kind of understood through gender, but at the same time, everyone is kind of androgynous from the start. So in order for you to become a man, like you need to detach your male part from your inside and present it as standing for your whole person. So this is what, being a man is. It has nothing to do with some kind of essential aspect, but it's a process of detachment that involves like becoming a man or becoming a woman, because inherently you could be both. I take this idea to understand this this internal duality between ruler and ruled. So in order for there to be a relation of rule in which I am obeying you, it is necessary as a condition that I have in myself the possibility of rule and being ruled, which is an idea that you find in Aristotle. So, but the context for that unity, for me to be a ruler or for me to be a rule, for me to detach that the ruling part of me or to detach the ruled part of me, the context is precisely the power relation. So in the first case, the context was the moment of the exchange, the encounter, in which kind of I'm measuring someone else's powers. In this case, it means it's precisely the fact that my power is always based on others' powers. So I have only the ability to do things because I have other people that can aid me, or because I know to use certain tools, or because I have weapons with me, or because, maybe I'm a citizen of a specific country, etc. But it's the composition and the external composition of my power that is relevant here. And also my internal duality as the ability of ruling and rule. So this external composition is what gives the context for the emergence of someone as a ruler or someone as a subject or the rule. So we have like a context for both of them, which is the context for their unification into a collectivity, or the unification as one side of a dual relation. And all these relations, they are modified through either the eclipsing or the detachment, which are two terms that's Stirthorn works, which are always actions. So it's always something that they do in order to eclipse or detach, and finally achieve that effect of a given unity, or a unity in the sense as one of a pair. I hope that was a little more clarifying. So just let me light up this room. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if we go with questions or commentaries, or I can clarify more things. I know that was, especially the last part, was a bit dense. I struggle to explain it in more simple terms because the original material is very much complicated in itself.
Certainly clarified it for me, like to find my way through a diagram. I don't know if people want to catch on there, or if we like open up generally. I think both is fine.
Yeah, I have questions in general, like things I wanted to talk about, but if there are other things on the realm of like clarification and things like that, I think they should go before.
Same. I have comments, but wait, I'll wait for clarification.
I think we can go for comments and then.
Sure.
Yeah.
John, do you want to go first? I forgot to raise my hand. The state has not seen me, so
Sure, I'll go ahead. I just wanted to first off, this was amazing and really helped tie a lot of things. But this diagram here is just kind of blowing my brain quite a bit, because it seems like this it has a lot of the categories and steps to tie together what seems to be like a very mode C kind of relationship in Cratic, and a very mode A kind of connection in Archic. Um, but also one of the questions we have in terms of how we're using category theory is a lot of what category theory did for mathematicians was help organize dualisms and different dualities that came up naturally in mathematics. And I think we've been looking for similar kind of ways to organize dualities in our own theory. And so this way that you've got like the pair of like internal external on the one hand and composite and dual on the other. And the way that those categories in their abstraction then give a framework for what we've been talking about in terms of the different social logics. Because when we first tried to think through the theory of the state in terms of like not just mode B, but like the diagram, the hexagonal diagram, we had this idea about like how the state kind of splits between a kind of affinity with mode A and like the nation state person logic, and then mode C and the more kind of infrastructural logistic logic. And so, but that was still very much kind of like in our terms. And so seeing it laid out like this from like all the resources that you're bringing to it really helps to both like tie things together, but also like these particular categories of like composite and dual and like internal external are really useful. And I'm going to be thinking about it a lot because it makes a lot of sense. Like even the eclipsing thing and the way that kind of is similar to commodity fetishism versus attachment and a lot of the ego, like it's very nice and really useful. And I think that it's going to really help kind of concretize our theory a lot. So thanks for doing this. This is great.
Yeah, I was excited to workshop some ideas. As I said, like I'm translating Karatani, so I'm kind of like sticking very closely to the text and paying attention to certain things that escaped me the first time I read. And and as I said, like I wrote my dissertation, I defended it, and then afterwards I started to realize how much of an influence Karatani was. But at the same time, uh, it's as if what I did today, like what this graph shows, is a kind of a problem for Karatani's theory, and that is in the sense that, and it's paradoxical because on the one, I'm kind of like following him in many of the steps. So like I'm taking Hobbes, for instance, as the central object of my analysis. Uh, there is some account of power and exchange, like that seems to be specific of the state. But I only construct that through tools of mode A and mode C. So like on the one hand, you have like this critique of fetishism and this understanding of social forms, which is coming directly from Marx. And I didn't go into, but like there's the reference to Althusser is not just like a wave of hands. I think that there is something analogous to the materiality of ideology and this problem of perspective. So we of the state specifically, even in Althusser's on text on the state apparatuses. So on the one hand, you have like this Marxist framework that I'm bringing in to understand the state, but understand the state in general terms, which I think is something that Marxist state theory struggles with. I'm not trying to understand the capitalist state in specific. I'm trying to understand statehood in general, which is something that is more akin to what Karatani does. But like all these concepts that I'm taking from like Strathern, Alfred Gell, and Simon Harrison, and Vivero de Castro, they're all concepts that explain a different social logic, that explain a logic that is based on reciprocity, on gift exchange, and things that are fundamentally broken with the institution of the state, which is a very important part of Karatani's argument, and that also, paradoxically, I kind of agree. So you have on the one hand, I think that if I am successful, I am showing that you can take the language used to explain mode A to explain mode B, like this notion of exchange here, the role of personification and objectification, eclipsing, like you take like the Stratherian terms, like this is something that people don't usually deal with. They go with Marcel Mauss, but this is the same tradition in very important ways. And I'm taking that and saying that, well, this actually helps to understand the state. So there is some kind of on the level of the intelligibility, there is some kind of transition from, and it's a kind of like quite smooth transition of how we understand mode B. And also like this graph here specifically, once I try to re-articulate Marx's argument in Capital and the problem of class domination through the same lens. Because the problem of class domination it's very similar to this, and it's very similar to the problem of gender relations. On the one hand, they're clearly dual and opposite. So like, like the worker is being exploited by the capitalists and so on. But if like when Marx describes what are the two terms, how do you say capital variável in English?
Variable capital.
So like variable capital, which is the leading labor part of capital, it's it's the worker. So like it's being eclipsed literally by capital. So you have, and this it's being composed into a unity, which is capital itself. So you can create the same kind, you can read the same kind of structure in the way class relations work on the one hand, in this kind of archic sociality, like the relation of domination between the two classes and their opposition and their differentiation, etc. And also how they are unified into something like one capital against another capital, like or one company against another company, or one national economy against another national economy. So like this is the paradox, like, and I don't know, I don't have the answer, honestly, because this is something that I arrived with a little bit of Karatani in my mind, but at the same time not being concerned with kind of like following his theory and not being concerned with where I would get with it. But I think that what it ends up doing is like showing how there is something that translates between social logics in the way that we can explain them. And yeah, so I think that it's I don't know exactly what to do with it, and I would appreciate insights, because sometimes I think that it kind of like goes in the same direction, and sometimes I think that it goes in an opposite direction, and I don't know exactly what to do with it.
Since you already said you have no idea, I feel entitled to say crazy things as well. So I just wanted to, you guys, I made a bunch of notes. I just wanted to throw them all in your direction. And please interrupt me as I do, because it actually is a lot. So you can just tell me what makes sense or not. But it does require me to share my screen. So sorry.
Let me stop.
Okay, let me just do it. Where is it here? No, so I was writing these things down as you were presenting, and I wanted to see what you think of them, because I think you gave us a really really interesting kind of more palatable approach to some of these issues just by adding that whole introduction on what is a perspective and kind of placing the problem of defining this construction. I think that's like such a cool insight to use the frontspice and analyze in detail how the subject is looking at the sovereign, who's like then looking at us, how this is relevant to understand what you're talking about. But the first thing that I was thinking about, which is this first thing here, I wonder if it is relevant and if you can see a way to connect it to what you're saying. It will come back in my comments, which is the following. You were mentioning just this kind of film theory bit from Laura Mulvey, the whole theory of the male gaze and things like this. And one thing that I see done very often when these concepts are used is that there is actually two operations that you need to account for. And maybe that's relevant when you want to add to this discussion not only the issue of the state, but the issue of mode C and value and so on. Because there are two ways to discuss this kind of construction of the gaze in film. One is more painting like geometrical, which has to do with the perspective, the point of view, and so on. But the other is the montage,
What is written there is like blue
person and subject.
person. Okay.
This is my proposal, my first crazy idea, which is maybe there is something to oppose here between, let's say, one thing is a construction of this sort. You have a frame and you have the way that people are framed, right? And the way that this relation is actually for these gays here, right? This is more what you focused on. This way of who exists for which point of view, right? This is the POV structure. But movies don't construct let's say, there's another, I don't know if you don't want to use POV for everything, but they don't just construct this kind of inherent structure of where people sit in the movie space by their relation with photography or the relation with how the scene is set up. It's also constructed with how one frame moves to the other, how one scene moves to the other. You have one shot here, and then you see, for example, the eyes that are looking at the person in the next shot.
The good
Right.
old Kuleshov effect.
For example, and all those things, right? And then the issue is not so much where is this POV here, right? So much as how this is the point of view that sees this, right? So it feels to me that maybe these two operations, one is more a matter of how you glue parts, the other is more a matter of POV. They name slightly different operations, right? Of course, they combine in very complex ways, but if you just take them to be, let's say, one is a totalization of everything that is going on, right? The other is a partial gluing of whatever is going on. Those are slightly two different things. I don't think that this here, I was just joking, like I don't think it's this simple, but there is something about this way, the way that this cut is absent, you know, and people like Mulvey will talk about how this absent cut is relevant for the construction of the consistency of the scene and the gaze, versus how this thing is absent because it's simply not part of the world of the movie, right? It's this infinite point of view that you're supposed to occupy. Like this, the difference between these two things seems very relevant to the thing that you're constructing. And I
also
wonder,
one is a condition for the other, right? Like you cannot have what she's calling like a male gaze without like the relation between cuts.
it's a
Like
question
because
because, for example, you can have an analysis of this point of view in painting, and then it's a static frame, and you still would have this.
yeah, but it doesn't create this is the specificity that she's bringing to cinema.
Sure. But then, I mean,
So
like, for example, this could be like a nice analogy if we want to talk about statehood and the development, you know, the birth of the modern state and the birth of perspective, which is something a lot of people talk about, with painting at the center. And then the analogy with the frontspice of Leviathan is very direct, right? Versus something that is more connected to industry, industrial revolution, you know, that type of enchainment of actions and operations that, I mean, cinema is such a modern art form. So maybe there is something also in the it's not a overcoming of this by this, but it's a supplementation that does kind of allow you to articulate something that at this level, this static level, is missing, right? So maybe there's, in this analogy, there is something there that you could put like some type of state logic here and some type of like capital state logic in this type of analogy.
But part of my argument is precisely the centrality of the apparatus. Like I didn't mention like Benjamin, but this is how I also read like the essay on the work of art. So like the shift from one kind of art to the other, like is the central aspect of the central feature of it is precisely the apparatus that is kind of like forcing the viewer to see certain things.
Mm-hmm.
So like of course that the painting is itself a medium, but it's a medium that is different from the screen because you don't, you know, when you're seeing the sequence of scenes, that sequence of scenes one is the same for kind of like everyone in the room because like they're all like seen through the camera or through the lens, which is necessarily hidden. So I don't think that you can put like, state on the one side and capital on the other, even though historically it would make sense. But my argument is kind of like ahistorical, because I'm saying, well, kind of like the frontispiece anticipates the logic of cinema.
Yeah, but this is I'll get to this, I swear, precisely to this
Okay.
point. When we get to this comment here, which is very crazy, I swear, there are like images and everything. Because there is a guy who questions exactly this idea, because there is a whole thing called the Hockney-Falco thesis, which claims that the invention of perspective is a technical invention of the camera obscura for painting. And painters who invented perspective, they were actually using something like a camera. They weren't painting by eye. And it is something that a lot of film theorists will say, that this is not the new thing about cinema. Editing is the new thing about cinema. So it doesn't really necessarily historically track also. I mean, it could actually historically track with what I'm saying. But this is just one point that I think it's interesting. I'll go back to it. The second point I wanted to mention is that, like, I'm not sure if this is like explicitly how you frame, but I just feel like it's such a clear background of a lot of your approach to things. Of course, like on the surface, it is a connection between Hobbes and like symmetric or kind of contemporary anthropology, and using the idea of perspective to further inquire into, okay, what is the actual logic of the formation and maintenance of statehood? But before that, I feel like your work it has this underlying strategy, which I deeply appreciate, because I think I hope I share it, which is to have an analysis of Marx's formal discussion that is kind of already assumes that there is something about his strategy for dealing with categories and concepts and his way of thinking about how things get autonomized and so on, that then informs the analysis of all social forms. So even your analysis of anthropology is already very informed by Marx's strategy. So that's kind of before everything, right? So something like this, like the general equivalent form, it feels like you're looking for a way to like generalize it. But what this equal sign and what this infinity of commodities that are equated with money, what this means changes from mode to mode. Like, what does it mean to be a multiple and a one, and to be either external, right, or internal? Like, it is this underlying strategy of Marx's kind of formal analysis of, money is a kind of weird connection between finitude and infinity, and a way of totalizing things that creates some autonomy, because now you can only see that totality through this particular thing. Like, but we don't want to be vulgar or crude in just pushing this analysis towards other modes of sociality. It needs to be modulated somehow, right? But it just feels to me, especially from today, that it's very, very kind of these kind of two sides of this equation. And what does this symbol mean? And what does this mean? It's pretty much at the core of what you're talking about, If I change the modes, how will these things relate, And then, of course, like there's something about just the formula for capital and kind of the formula for autonomy of state, where suddenly you don't have people, the state, and people, but you have the state with the people, the means for the reproduction of the state. It feels like that's also, how we could expand that analogy if you would take it further. But I wonder if that's that kind of strategy and that kind of issue with the form, the logical forms, is something that makes sense to you to summarize it like that.
I think you're absolutely right. You really like captured it, and I think that what made me not write a dissertation on Hobbes and Marx, say, or like or expanding Marx's analysis in Capital of commodities to the political realm and translating it, even though I think that it's perhaps possible. But what drove me off from that movement is that it's very common to make the association between the money form and sovereignty. Karatani does it, like Zizek does because of Karatani. There is like this old guy on symbolic forms that does it as well, and he does like with psychoanalysis too. Like
Joseph Gould.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like the it's not in itself like a new thing. The problem is like what is in Marx's analysis that is it's defining what in Marx's analysis is generalizable to other social forms and what isn't. And with money, we have a clear problem. Like when Marx defines money, he says money is three things: measurement of value, means of exchange, and like money property. The sovereign cannot work as a means of exchange. I try to construct the sovereign as state as an object, as an object of exchange, but it's like it goes through a whole different path than the one in capital. And at
Yeah,
the
you
same
would have to
time, like
probably talk about like absolute monarchy and like mutual recognition amongst sovereigns and like marriages between sovereigns and things like this.
yeah, but it's too focused on monarchy, which historically wouldn't make much sense. And also like the sovereign, I think that worse than means of exchange is the measurement of value. Like sovereignty cannot, like you can try to make an argument for citizenship or something like that, but I never found a way to do this satisfactory.
Yeah, no, I
So
understand.
so it is behind my head because there is something that clearly resonates between the two things. And it's not by chance that Marx, is talking about some kind of a social contract of commodities. It's not by chance that in the introduction to the so-called introduction published with the Grundrisse, he starts with Rousseau. Like it's not by chance that there are all these references to like the to omni lupus in Capital. Like I mean, like several things. Like they appear here and there. Karatani like makes the direct analogy between the two like many times, but there is something that escapes it, and I think that it's really hard to pinpoint exactly. So I try to give up on this idea, like for a moment, and try to understand through some kind of similar social logic in the back of my mind how we could understand the state. And like through Marshall Salins, through Village Castro, through Strathern, like through all the like this ways of understanding the mode A. And it worked somehow. I mean, I think, like
I just added this image. Do you know this thing that Marx drew, right? Of these all these heads on top of the other like this.
yeah, I saw this image before, but I never thought about it.
I mean,
Like now
this
that I'm
this has
seeing in this context,
yeah,
now
exactly.
I'm
This
thinking
looks
things.
it would be amazing to compare this kind of people looking to the side and one is kind of on top of the other, It would be really interesting to see what you get from that, It's just one side of a page of notes for Capital Volume 1. But this takes me to the third point that I wanted to make, which is more concerning the logic. And it's, I think that like, I'm really curious what you think about this because, for a while now, I mean, this is how, like, that very basic thing we always talk about, this kind of idea of different logics for each mode. And you have this idea of a frontier for mode A, where if you have like these two things, they can still share a frontier in a way that Y is not exactly outside of X here, right? Versus this idea of a cut, where in this case here, there is no shared frontier between X and Y. Let's say the limit here is totally on the side of one of the two parts, right? But one thing we never explored properly, like we discussed this at the level of space, which is the easiest to think about groups and how they are separated when you talk about inside and outside and so on. We spoke a bit about time because, for example, you could derive very recognizable types of temporality from this schema, where, for example, a previous moment in time, this is T1 and this is T2. And you could say that the previous time is contained in the present time and vice versa in a certain way. That seems very relevant to interpreting temporality in mode A dominant situations versus this kind of clear cut between moments in time for the state, where you just think about, like how political time for the state needs to be so clear cut. Like this was a government, this is a new government. The past is the past, the present is the present, and so on. So time and space we spoke about, but scaling and kind of the move from individuals to groups we never spoke about it, and it actually should fit. Like nothing prevents us. Here it's hard to understand, but it's something like if you have a bunch of people, okay, and they all have relations amongst each other, but you can kind of see that this person here is in a position of leadership of or what we call a co-limit for these connections. Like whatever happens to this person, it is connected to everything else in a way that others are not connected to everyone else, right? So it would establish some division here.
Like a
And you,
Melanesian big man.
yeah, like you could say that this is the point of view for the relations, right? And this could be anything. This could be like a supervisor, and these are workers. This could be captain of a soccer team, and these are the other players. You can have many, many relations. Now, the status of this division could be described by the three logics. So you could have a situation where you have many people and you have something like a position of leadership, and you would say that this is a frontier, meaning the person who is here remains connected to the people who are here. You could never say that this is something other, fully other, right? This would be more like mode A, where this person is both in this side and separate at the same time, versus something like the cut that we would need to make this person a representative, where you have everyone here, but this is a cut. The person on the other side of this is fully disconnected in some sense from the people who are here, right? So this is what I try to draw here. Like you can have like a frontier.
What is the equivalent of mode C?
It's where this is a margin, right? And how much you are disconnected and how much you are connected, it's actually a function of how these two things will now relate to a different margin and so on and so forth, right? Everything is open. And if you look at this drawing here, it does look a bit like that. Like who is the bottom layer and who is the top layer of these heads here? It feels like it's kind of resolution dependent. It's dependent on whatever is kind of meaningful in that context, right? It's very context dependent compared to the Leviathan, for example, where this big drawing is clearly the totality of this underlying thing, right? So we never discussed this kind of scaling aspect, where this is now somehow the totality and these are the parts, and that this cut here is actually modulable as well. It can be mode A, B, or C. And why am I bringing this? Because there is an interesting question here, which is sticking with mode B, we would have two options. We have the option where the limit belongs to the bottom part and the above part is on the other side of this cut. Or you have the inverse, where this here is the limitless part, right? And the cut belongs to the upper part. And I wonder if this distinction is meaningful to some of the things you're talking about and discussing, you know, because one feels
this is the state as sovereign and the state as people.
Right? It doesn't it look like that?
No, and more than that, now it made me, this is really, really interesting because I think that I talked with Gabriel about this like several times already, which is I never can figure out the role of law in mode B. Because on the one hand, mode B only makes sense if it's if the world that it constructs, it's a kind of like a juridical world. And that is a problem for Karatani because the way that he describes mode B is some kind of like real political exchange of protection and obedience. So it's not necessarily concerned with the legality of the matter. But you know, like the fact that we arrived at the conclusion that it is a kind of classical logic that runs mode B kind of corroborates the idea that it is that is somehow fundamentally juridical because law is inherently binary and classical in this sense, but power isn't. And so if you try to understand power, you can only understand through the logic of mode A, in which, you know, the powerful person is still a member of the group, but it's like a little bit outside of it. But there is kind of like, you know, like I obey you as a leader, but only insofar as you were a good leader, because the moment that I think that, you know, that becomes a problem, like I jump out. Or it works as this, as the logic of mode C, which is, you know, like in relation to other leaders, in relation to other states, or in relation to, like other collectivities. But if you try to understand power through mode B alone, with this stark opposition, and either you're on the top or either you are on the bottom, you don't understand power at all. Like you miss. You're talking about right. You're talking about law. So but at the same time, our vocabulary on power comes through like mode B, or it's kind of formed through the vocabulary of mode B, which is the paradox. And kind of what I'm trying to show is look at mode A, and then you can understand how mode B works, even though that is repressed. You have like a myth of the state that you can understand in mythical terms, but the state always has to kind of like mess up that temporal collapse, that temporal limit that you're talking about. It needs to say like there is past, there is present. If you look at space, there are several coexistences living together, but the state needs to say like this is the frontier, this is inside, this is outside. But it always the problem of mode A always comes back. Like this is the problem of sovereign exception in Schmidt.
But don't you think
have that thing always coming back?
But for example, I mean, I'm just gonna pass along to John, but just to conclude on that point before I mention the next step, it feels to me like, let's say the state like appears either as this way or this way, right? Because either it will be the people who have the power to put limits, or it's the ruler who rules, right? Either the people are rulers in the sense that they set up a law or a pact, or it's this upper totality that has this limiting power. But to actually, let's say, make these two things connect, either you do this or you do this. And this is the logic of mode A, because you're going to join two sides with their limits, and that makes a frontier. Or you will abolish the frontier and join just the as if they're two marginal sides. This is the logic. If you just take the limitless part, you're establishing something like a bargain, where we're constantly negotiating where the limit is. And if you set up the A, we're actually establishing a frontier where the sovereign will be and will not be separate suddenly. It's the two-body kind of issue. So those are ways of gluing this instability of when we set up a cut, where will this cut fall? With the people or with the sovereign, right? Maybe there's something there. But I know John has his hand up and I'm totally monopolizing. So John, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another level to that, because I think there's a few different places in the math we've been looking at that we kind of use to think through mode B. And so we've got this one of the kind of cut that Gabriel just described. And in it, like you can see it in a sense as like the shapes that contain their own boundary. That is the mathematical definition of like a closed shape, and the ones that don't have a boundary are open. So in a way, this sense of mode B is combining the logic of mode A and mode C kind of side by side. But there's the other level of thinking of mode B as a power set, which is less about having one side have a boundary and the other side not, as more of like having an infinitesimally thin boundary between things that line up and fit together perfectly. And I think that power set picture, which is almost always requires you to throw out a lot of stuff that doesn't fit that, gives us a good idea of the like ideal state of legibility that Allan is describing here, where the state has everything in its proper place and there's no excess and there's no gaps. Everything is completely distinguished and all the information has been accounted for. So you do have an idea of a perfect map. But because reality doesn't actually fit that at all, and because modes A and mode C do such a good job at these different levels of scale, it also has to weirdly combine those operations. And the model for that is called a bi-hating algebra, which literally combines two kinds of logics together. And that's actually more complex than a power set. So I think there's like maybe like a dual level here between a kind of simplistic ideal model that the state strives for, that is like what we kind of think of as classical logic the perfect mapping of things. And then this more like effective logic that Gabriel just mapped out in terms of a cut that actually requires more structure, even if at another level it's kind of it's designed to solve problems in a very like brutally efficient way by just institutionalizing this cut. And I think maybe that kind of level of structures is kind of what helps us to then kind of start to link the math back to this pair of dualities of inside outside or internal external and duality multitude. But I have to think about that more and come back to that. But I think that there's a lot of really interesting tie togethers here.
Also, I think there is a historical interesting thing, which is, like, because in the analysis here, like we have like the three kind of logics and they're kind of like on equal footing. But historically, logic develops first as classical, but classical logic doesn't solve all problems posed by classical logic itself, and therefore, like it tries to find solutions in other and articulate other kinds of logic.
Yeah, but actually,
like
historically, paraconsistent came before classic, I think.
But not as we know as logic, right?
No, I mean, depends. Like Parmenides and like being is, non-being is not is very late compared to like paraconsistency stuff in, I don't know, different Hindu logics, and everything was kind of theological, right? But you will find a lot of discussions on paradoxes of the one before somebody says, hey guys, let's stop this and let's have one thing is one thing, another thing is another thing. And logic is really cool. Like, I don't know, like there is an argument to be made that the three logics were developed at the moment that these things were.
But it's the same thing with philosophy. Like, of course, that there existed philosophy before the Greeks, but there is a reason why we call it philosophy. Like it comes from a Greek word. I mean, like, just like logic. I think that there is like something about that moment that created that kind of rule. Like, well, like the exclusion of the of the third of what is the exclusion of the middle third. Like those things, like they kind of like created what we know as logic, but then we can look back and see, well, but this kind of way of thinking is, like it's on the same footing, it's doing the same thing as what we started to call logic.
Yeah, but I think that just on this point, I mean, it's just a side point. I don't want to take too much time, but I think one should read Aristotle's kind of three basic principles of Aristotelian logic, more in the sense of monotheism's prohibition of devotion to other gods. Like monotheism is not like there is no other god. It's like clearly there are, but just worship this one. It's like, guys, don't do this because good logic is without, excludes the third and has no middle term. Like, because you could use those things, so you need to exclude them. So they were out there, right? So, but anyway, I just wanted to add something that I think John made the perfect kind of segue to it.
Just real quick on that point, though, like I think that's where you can link to a lot of the stuff around property explicitly, right? Like Greece had a far more developed legal system that was anchored in property, and it had a legal system that required argumentation with reference to one's property right claim. So I think like the linking between like the need for the cut as mode B, like you just described, Gabriel, and then the like ideal model of the power set for logic. There's a reason those do come up in Greece.
Yeah. I mean, and just using this power set issue as a connection, right? Like when you start talking about perspective, man, I'm not sure if you've read this stuff, but the one of the most genius guys on perspective is that painter, David Hockney. Hockney, he's obsessed with perspective. He has very profound theses on perspective, but he also studied the history of perspective. And in parallel, he studied the technical means for development of modern perspective in painting. He had this theory, right? He went to an exhibition by some classic modern painter, and he said two things, like, why are his paintings so small? And second, I'm a good painter. I would never paint this good. Like, how can he be this good at perspective? And then he came up with the idea that he was using some technical apparatus that was substituting the eye as a measure for these geometric lines. And there was like a 10-year long study. He published a book called Secret Knowledge, trying to show that most of these great Dutch painters we know who kind of pioneered perspective, they were actually using like a proto film camera to project images. And that's why their paintings are kind of the same size. The lines are really perfect, but you can even derive the deformation of the lens they used by the deformations in the geometry of the painting. So he really went far with this. But the other side of his research is the issue of infinity and perspective in modern versus Western versus Eastern paintings, and especially China. So he makes this is a drawing by him, where he says to see the bigger picture is to see more. And he says this is the ordinary perspective where infinity is inside the painting, and you have this kind of lines towards us, right? This is what's happening in this type of thing, right? You can see here the lines, infinity there, and the line, blah, blah. And he says, no, but we need to work on the reversion of perspective. Like this is his kind of manifesto. Perspective should be reversed. And you can see that this is going this way, but not only this way. You look at this guy here with his arms. It's pulling the classic perspective inside of this inverted perspective, right? And you have, look at these lines here with this line here. He's trying to show that you can actually move to what he calls this infinities of perspective when you do this, right? So it's like this thing here. Either you have the classic perspective where the point of infinity is inside the painting, right? Or you can have this kind of pluralization of these infinities with this inverted point of view where you are in the position of infinity, and you get this different type of mirroring, right? He even says, like, when you have this type of perspective here, infinity's push is making a pressure on objects from this side, and so on. It's very interesting. You can see like this type of painting, but he goes back to analyze a lot of classic panorama paintings, for example, in China, Chinese painting from different periods, and he shows you that that's how people usually did kind of big landscapes. Landscapes weren't developed with this infinity inside of them. They were kind of full of different perspective lines here, like this. The perspective of this street, it's not really matching the perspective of this, which is not really matching this perspective, and so on, right? So it's interesting that it's not like a kind of ultra-modern thesis of toppling this classic modern point of view, but it's also something that he recuperates, saying, yeah, but perspective didn't emerge with this modern kind of geometrization with Alberti and those guys. Before that, you had this other type of thing where you have this play, where you have like a totality. You can have like a street which is drawn like this, so it's pushing to this point here at infinity. But then this street is actually drawn in something else, which is putting the perspective on the outside here in this way, with a point of infinity outside of the screen of the painting or something. You can have these multiple things, right? And he does like a lot of crazy things like that. So why am I saying this? Because as you were talking about, I realized that, well, there is something, this whole discussion is very interesting for us to kind of use this issue of scaling to talk about kind of use the scaling and the geometric perspective that you were talking about to go back to that idea of how do you totalize some series into something else, because it's kind of like this, right? This is at infinity, right? Like Marx is explicit about this. Like that's why the dialectics of money is so confusing, because it's a finite quantity of something infinite, right? When you have $10, you have any commodity infinite, but you only have $10 worth of it, finite, right? And I was wondering about this because it feels like a lot of both the problems of statehood, but also this kind of other ways you can find it, both in like Melanesian and even more contemporary social forms. It has a lot to do with and it goes back to what John was saying. It has a lot to do with the status of a totality with regard to what was totalized, right? And is it like purely inaccessible. So you have like an operation, you have like numbers, finite numbers, right? And you then have some other number which is simply not finite, and it's therefore outside. It's totally outside, and it's not a number, right? This is different from, for example, having a bunch of numbers. Then you have a set which totalizes them, but this itself can be totalized inside of a different set. You can have multiple cardinalities of infinite things, right? This type of painting here, it assumes this. If you can have one infinity inside of the other, this infinity here must be bigger than this somehow, or at least the same size, right? Versus this situation here where this is the only thing that is infinite. It's outside, the painting is painting this infinite point, this inaccessible point, and it's framing everything with regards to it. That's something, it's a different logic, right? So I think that connects with what John was saying. Like, it's another way of approaching the modes that is more directly concerned with what's the status they give to transcendence, right?
This is really absolutely fascinating, and now I want to read Hockney's
It's amazing. You love it. I'm sure
book.
you're gonna love it. Yeah.
No, and I was looking for things on this, like I mean, like, of course, perspective is something that people have analyzed like endlessly in art theory, but not not necessarily in interesting ways. And I think that your example is really good because it shows one, how the state is, what I'm trying to say with the state forcing the perspective. So like, the whole problem is precisely that, like when you're looking at the world, you're seeing like multiple things, but when you're looking at the painting is kind of like showing you how to see. And this is a trait of linear perspective. But then with the anamorphosis part, is not even like that you can just look away from the painting. It has something about the apparatus that makes you see, and that apparatus is a social machine. It's a social apparatus. And do you know the work of Pellicas? He's a photographer. I'm going to share my screen link very quick, but he makes these kind of images. So like he kind of like he's overlapping several images. Of course, it's digitally edited, but all the pictures like are from the same point. But he's taking pictures of movement. So like what I think is really interesting in his work is that like one of the problems of realism is that it tends to take for granted that an image is representing reality, especially in photography, because you're literally taking a picture of like a scene, but the reality of like a pool or a reality of a tennis court or the reality of like a crossing it's never like that people are standing still like in singular points. Like it's precisely that they're moving, that there are several people, that lots of them are going back and forth. So like I think that this is it's similar to the Chinese example of the panoramic painting, because it's trying to show several things taking place at the same time. But still with some kind of perspective involved, but it's a different one. It's a perspective that is not the linear perspective kind.
If you look at this, it's hard to find the full documentary, but he did a documentary with this other guy on just one famous painting called, I think, A Day on the Grand Canal, and it's exactly this, exactly as you said. It's a day of the emperor in this canal. So it's not a static thing. It's actually the emperor will appear in many places in the same painting. So it's
the interesting thing about it as well is, like, as I said, Hobbes differentiates between representations that conceal the representation and representations that make it explicit. And this kind of representation, like from a aesthetic point of view, it forces the viewer to realize that this is a representation. Like this is a representation of a day. This is not a day. A day is different. Like you only will experience a day by going through a day, or you only experience a day of an emperor by being an emperor and experiencing that day. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to understand what that is. You can represent it in several ways, but it is a representation. And I think that is an interesting. It always has interesting political effects. Because the moment that you understand that someone is in a position of power because you are on some level granting them power, it changes the power relation that you have between you and them. Like, and that is the case in small scale groups, like the leader of a small community. But I think that that also is true for large scale groups. Like ultimately the power of like the United States of America is contingent. It can crumble next day. Like there's nothing like inherently holding it up. And I think that that's an interesting thought to have. But I really like the commentaries and yeah, thanks a lot.
John, I just wonder if you could also talk a bit more about what you said regarding power sets, because from what you said now, Allan, what I was thinking is, you know, uh, and it is something that is, I mean, it's hard to make the connection very explicitly, but I feel it's clearly there because, for example, power sets in this idea that you have a couple of elements and then you have the set of parts of those elements, and the set of parts it's very much like the set of all relations that these elements can have, right, in a certain sense. So if you have two elements x and y, you have a power set with four relations because they can be on their own, they can be connected, or you can just have nothing, right? But another way of thinking about this is that you have something like the representational space, the power set. But it's also, to call it this representational space, it's because it is disconnected from the set in a certain way. You have the elements, and then you have the set of relations between elements. If those sets of parts, some of those parts were elements themselves, so you have a set that has, x, y, and it's part of the set, the subset x and y. And then you would have the power set of these three elements. You start getting this weird kind of reflexive aspect, right? It's not, let's say, a well-behaved representation if somehow you collapse the two registers, right? You have two people, and then you have the representative of these two people. But then if you count the representative as a person, suddenly the two domains are collapsed, right? That's not a problem for a paraconsistent structure, because you can have the totality being one of the things that's being totalized. But it is more of a problem for a classic logic, because you want that representational space to have everything and only everything, and with no gaps, as John was talking about. So it does feel like something about this kind of, under which conditions is this uncoupling produced, but also kind of made invisible, right? It's not itself something that is presented. Seems very relevant to have a domain of like political representation, whereas it feels like it's no wonder that we wouldn't call a charismatic leader who is kind of constantly gaining power from our side, but also giving us something in return, because it's one of us, but it's not one of us, like a communitarian leader, right? It's not, we wouldn't say that they represent us, right? Because you haven't really given the conditions for something called representation to settle. Like you have in between that composition and dualism that you were talking about, things need to be slightly more coupled together for that to be the case. Like it's not exactly the same logic to say, like I've never seen anyone talk about a communitarian leader that they represent them. They are one of us. That's why they are different from us, right?
Yeah, but I think that this is an issue with how people talk about themselves and how we can talk about their relation, kind of like emic and etic, like vocabularies. I don't think that they would use the vocabulary of representation, because representation is associated with the state and with official representatives. But I think that there is some kind of representation involved in something like a community leader.
Why?
And because I think that the community leader on some level is standing for the whole group.
But that's the point. Like, aren't there different ways? Like, how would you then distinguish?
I think that there are different ways. There are different ways, and they're different. A community leader is different from like a congressman.
In which way?
But it doesn't. In the way that the congressman needs to have that kind of like official binary, like no gaps structure in which, like, on the day he's the congressman, when he goes to sleep at night, he's just a citizen, and the community leader has to. It kind of overlaps. There is no officiality involved. Like the official is absent, but representation, I don't think, is absent. I think representation is there.
Yeah, because like to me, it's the difference between, let's say, taking a sample out of a set of numbers and saying, let's analyze natural numbers. Take the number 7, for instance. You know, it's a representative because it is very much ordinary. You know, and you probably want to take as your example the most ordinary, or the natural number that has the most interesting properties of natural numbers, right? Versus the set of natural numbers, which stands in for all natural numbers, which is more transcendent because it's not, in a certain sense, a natural number, right? So it's infinite, right? Like those, it's true that in a certain sense, like taking a sample of something is a representation because a part standing in for something bigger, but it's a very different sense from when the part that stands in for something bigger is standing in not for. You see my point? Like it's standing in is slightly different. Like if we want to use the word representation for both things, I'm okay with it. I don't mind, but it does feel like then there is an adjective we need to put there to distinguish the two things.
No, I agree with it. I'm just saying that I think that there is representation in the first case. It's just that we don't usually talk about it in these terms because of the way that representation has been historically constructed as a kind of juridical, like a category of the mode B, let's say. But I think that you can find representation in the other logics as well. And I mean, like, I don't see why not calling it representation. Because it faces very similar problems of political representation.
Really? Because I mean, it's such a common thing that precisely the moment that community leaders are taken as representatives of community in the sense that the state does, that they lose their position, right? That they become something else. So it does feel, for me, it feels like very much like a good example of how frontier scaling, this element stands in for the whole only insofar as it remains inside of the thing that is being totalized. You know, he's one of us, being the statement that demarcates their exceptionality. He's one of us, that's why he's exceptional, puts him inside so that he can be the totality, the representative, right? Versus something else, which is, you know, he was voted as a representative, whether you like it or not. Now he stands for everyone. It doesn't matter if he's not like us. In fact, it's a proof that he's not somehow, right? That's important because he needs to have a more rational point of view. He needs to be more impartial or whatever. Like those two things, that second one looks to me more like and you can even see the inversion, right? Where he's a representative because through vote we gave him power, and then it becomes, but now he has a power we cannot take away from him through personal motivations because the representative is now autonomous to us. It's almost the duality of the two ways the cut works in mode B. We gave it to him, but now we cannot take it back, right? In some way. That's mode B versus the other one where the circuit is more, I mean, we can learn new things about ourselves through a charismatic leader. We can see ourselves differently through them, but there is a frontier that we share. He needs to remain, or she needs to remain one of us. It's a different logic, right?
I see what you're saying, and I agree with some of it, especially because, you know, the kind of like this Clausian aspect of, you know, like the moment that it becomes a representative, it loses its power, etc. At the same time, it seems that there is always like this pressure from the outside for this kind of identification and this kind of like representation when the state is involved. So like the fact that the state is, that official representation exists kind of like makes a pressure on all other forms of representation, I mean, scare quotes, to be more like the representation of the state. but you know, like this kind of even when you're trying to understand something like an official representative, you cannot understand it only through its official representative aspect. You know, like there's always something like a charismatic dynamic going on, you know, like some kind of like group psychology like work taking place. You know, like there is one side of it which is purely official, you know, like I have a badge, therefore I stand for the state. But that is never like the whole story. Like even in mode B, even when you're talking about very like clearly traditional state-like structures. So because that's never the whole story, in clearly where clearly it is the case that it's kind of like an official representative, I also think that you can see like that kind of like the material problem of power. Let's put it in this way in other forms.
Okay, but this is where my critique of you would come in, just so I pass it along to John also. But because it feels to me sometimes that when you say things like, but that's not always just, it's not only that. Yeah, but because these logics are mixed, so it's hard for me sometimes to understand if this level of complexity where there is this other dimension going on and so on, it's inherent to the logic of the state, or is it because the logic of the state is being built on something else? Because like to me, what's very convincing in our analysis, especially the way you used, didn't mention that much, but the Althusser thing and how the interplay of perspective might be very useful to understand interpolation more profoundly. It's because, you know, it's almost like interpolation, the subject in the interpolation is like a partial perspective, is an asymmetric perspective building, where the policeman exists due to something, but then from their perspective, we don't exist again, unless under certain conditions. So it's no longer the interplay of that supernatural encounter where things can go sideways, but can go both ways. One way, one time, another way, another time, because everyone is capable of being a perspective. It's the monopoly of perspective is coming together with the monopoly of violence, right? Meaning, if I'm part of the dominant white community in Brazil, I kind of know police will always see me as a person. If I'm black, that's up to discussion at every encounter, but it's only in one way. There's no situation where I will be a perspective and the police will not be a person, because they have the monopoly due to the state. So it's convincing to me that the statehood implies a cut in the perspective game. And that sounds very kind of in tune with things that we developed. But the fact that there is an underlying machinery that remains more symmetric doesn't necessarily convince me that this is also part of the statehood dynamic. It might just be the underlying communitarian structure that you need to build a state, because you still need dominated and dominating communities, right? They remain communities. So that interplay, which is more symmetrical, is behind that state logic. So sometimes when you say like, yeah, but there's this underlying dynamic, I wonder if it should be considered an additional complication to the state logic, or it's more a matter of you situating this logic inside what it actually needs to disentangle or retangle to be efficient, you know?
No, I see this, and this is what I'm trying to put into words as like my trouble with Paratani, which is precisely what you're describing. So like in his account, you have the logic of mode A, which on a fundamental level already contains mode B and C, but in kind of a negative way. And then you have the emergence of the state, which kind of like captures the community, like the agrarian community, like he calls like that it's based on mode A, and uses it in another way. So you start to have like agriculture, you start to have like cities in Texas, and there's like this whole like domination of like one community over another, and so on. And you have an exchange between them. And the exchange is like, I offer you protection, you offer me obedience, but also because I know that I cannot only rely on violence, I offer you like public goods. And you know, there's this kind of like and this is a different, for in his theory, this is a different kind of exchange. This is not like there is a little bit of reciprocity involved in the sense that I give you obedience, you give me, like protection, but it's not reciprocal in the sense of creating a obligation. Is very much one-sided. It's different. So like this is his thought. And then I think that you can understand this in two different ways. On the one hand, you have like mode A-like relations everywhere. So you imagine like the court of a king, and you have like all these reciprocal marriage ties. You have like all these scheming interests and like all these like this kind of quid pro quo going on. And like I do something for you, but you have my back on the next thing, and things like this. So like, but above it all, there is like this other logic, which is like official. It's like like there's like a different language. There's this whole game of etiquette, and like things like this. And this is another way of understanding, which is, and sometimes I think Karatani is more on the side of this other way of understanding, which is so there is mode A here on the local aspect. You have like in James Scott, like you have the city is organized in its own way, it's very chaotic. But when the state official comes, there's another kind of exchange here involved, and it needs to be everything legible for the state, and you have like a tax system and a property system, and like and surnames and things like this. So like it's not like mode A is everywhere, and you have like this kind of cover of mode B, kind of in Deleuze and Guattari's terms, overcoding everything. It's more like you have small communities that still work on the way that they used to work, that now have to adapt with a larger, not formal, not kind of like, but very like material way that is a different kind of exchange. And I struggle with this idea because I don't think that this is how law works. For instance, this is not how most of state functions work. I think that you can only, if you really want to understand how the state works, you need to either read it through the reciprocal relations between persons that often follows the rules that you find in mode A, or in today's society, you look at the capitalist motive, and you look at it from the standpoint of money, from profit, from accumulation of capital, etc. Because law necessarily excludes both of these things in its own self-understanding. And in all the politics in the state happens in that language of law. But at the same time, there are these two underlying logics that actually explain what is going on in these things in politics, in official politics. So this is why I struggle with it. This is why I say there is something more. But how exactly to frame it, I don't know. And now that I'm reading Karatani more closely, I'm not even sure if it is a critique, because I'm not sure if he's falling into this trap that I'm presenting,
Yeah.
Especially because he writes in such an austere way that sometimes it's hard to really make sense of what he's saying in a single sentence. So maybe we could go with Dennis, who didn't speak yet. I think that there are some questions in the chat as well.
John was ahead of me. I don't know if you want to say something, John.
No, I'm good. I've gone.
Okay. This is just a short comment. I mean, first of all, it's a great presentation and the discussion. This is a perfect way to kick off the series, and it really brought all the most important questions up for me. I just wanted to have a movie recommendation, since we were talking about film and Chinese paintings and the state, all these things. Have you guys heard of this movie? I think it's called in English Lychee Road. I'll type it here.
I thought you were going to say that Kurosawa movie, Hashimon. No, the one that has multiple perspectives.
Rashomon. Yeah. This is a movie that came out this year. Yeah,
Holy shit, the
very
poster for it is crazy.
it's amazing. You guys need to watch it. But it has all these concepts in play. The premise is that it's in the Tang Dynasty in China, and the emperor wants to have some fresh lychee. It's like a fruit um, for his daughter's wedding. And the problem is that lychee spoils in 3 days, and the closest source for fresh lychee is like very far away. So this guy gets the task to carry lychee like an impossible distance in order to get it to the king. So that's the premise, right? But without spoiling the movie, I wanted to suggest like because we talked about the theme of power from the dimension of mode A and from mode B. And from the way I understand, Alon, you can correct me if I misunderstood your point here, but I think that the way power looks from mode A is exactly what you said, where it's kind of this contradictory dual form of like sovereign versus people or sovereign versus multiple. Um, from the perspective of mode B itself, when it sees its own power, it doesn't see power, but it sees legibility, like exactly all the stuff about power set, right? Schematization. That doesn't appear as power as such, it just appears as like clarity or um, maneuverability, let's say. But this film, I think, proposes the perspective from mode C, looking at the power of the state, and that perspective shows power to be pure waste or excess, right? Something that escapes calculation and is actually like a drain on society in a way. So I think this film is kind of like takes that position of mode C, looking at mode B. So I think this triad of pairs, triad of logics pairs well with what you're saying here.
Like
So
Bataille's A Curse Shares thesis.
yeah, exactly.
This movie looks amazing.
This.
Yeah, definitely let's watch it. Plus it goes well with Monica's, I think. Monica's going to talk about China as well in a few weeks. So
There were some questions in the chat. Uh, Michael asks, how would you use this analytical model you apply to think about the state to interpret the current political context in the US? Where on the one hand, there is an appeal to sovereignty, on the other, street process under slogan, no kings. It's funny, in my defense, one of my committee members asked if the fact that Trump got elected didn't undermine my thesis. And I think it's the opposite. I think it's just a clear example of what I'm saying. On the one hand, you always have the tendency, for a leader to try to divinize itself, to become something transcendental, to identify itself with the state or with the whole community. And often there are like mechanisms to prevent that from happening. Like there is this process that many that Kantorovich describes, but also like several other political anthropologists describe, which is adverse sacralization. So like, the king is so perfect that it cannot make wrong decisions, and therefore it's better that it doesn't make decisions at all, and kind of like puts it in a kind of golden cell in which it is so powerful or so perfect that it doesn't even affect reality. It doesn't even have the real power to change things, and government is done by some kind of other bureaucrat. So I think that those two possibilities are always possibilities. Things can go both ways. What you're seeing in the US today is, someone in a clear traditional juridical structure trying to do a power grab and succeeding many times and failing sometimes. And people are resisting that power grab and using sometimes the same language, like the language of legality, or the language of the Constitution, or the language of fundamental rights or human rights, or things like this, which is in the same way the language that the power grabber is also trying to use to legitimate his own position. I don't see a lot of contradiction between this between my account and the current account. I think it is just like it's not even from my standpoint, not my personal perspective, but from the standpoint of the theory that I'm constructing, it's not even an exceptional situation. It's pretty much like one of possible several other outcomes. But it falls perfectly into the structure, I think. So I'm not sure. There is another question from Tomas, but Mo and John now have and Gabriel have their hands raised, so I'm not sure what we do.
Maybe Mo first, then John, who has his hand up. Then I'll read the question and I'll go last.
One question I had was you brought up the state as both a generic standpoint and the standpoint of the other for subjectivation. And wait, maybe I'll also jump here. And actually, Gabriel, you already kind of equated that with the after one has those developments of the value form with the money forms, and you've been talking about that, Allan. And there's this equivalence analogy between the latest the state as the full final development of mode B, and capital as the full final development of mode C, as they both provide something of a generic standpoint and the standpoint of another, where always also this whole perspectivism kind of comes into play. So we are kind of on this last level of the development of money form in Marx, or whatever the equivalent would be for mode B. And what seems strange to me, in comparison to your analysis of this image of the Leviathan, was that there's nothing alike to that for capital. There's this phantasmatic image of the Leviathan. There's nothing like that. And I don't know what to do with that, but it seems kind of strange. It seems to hint at some structural difference somehow. This otherness of the state is still something which is, in some sense, more than kind of out of the visual space, as this infinity, or this point of infinity is outside of the image, but it is still visualizable. Yeah, I don't know. There's although the analogy in capital seems to be on the same level as the state, it doesn't have the same. Yeah, it's not depictable in the same phantasmatic way. I don't know. I'm just throwing that ball at you.
No, yeah, I think that's right. And this is what I was saying about the difficulty of finding the parallel between what Marx is saying in other social logics. What it is that Marx is articulating that is kind of universalizable, and what is in his analysis that is specific to capitalism, and it cannot be universalizable. I think that this is the problem of historical materialism in general, which for me, for Marx, was an unfinished project, something that he never managed to conclude. And towards the end of his life, he was like trying to understand pre-capitalist social formations, precisely to understand what it is that is specific to capitalism and what it is that is specific to human forms of organization. And you can find everywhere. And this is an interesting case. But there is this piece by Susan Buck-Morss that I just sent in the chat that is titled Envisioning Capital. And it kind of like builds from Jameson's cognitive mapping, because Jameson's cognitive mapping thesis is precisely what you're saying. You know, like he says, like there are three stages of cognitive mapping. Early capitalism, things were depictable more or less, but then in late capitalism, you completely lost the ability to have a picture of global capital or something like this. And on the one hand, it's true. And on the other hand, there are like attempts to do that through several ways. There's this, anyway, so there's this piece. I think that it might interest you if you're interested in that problem. I also think that it's fascinating that there are no other alternatives to Hobbes Leviathan. You know, like if people are talking about the state, if they're talking about an image, they're using Hobbes Leviathan. It's not like there is like a plethora of possible images. Like capital has no image, the state has one. And it's just like, and it's just this one. Like no one has come up with another one. So like I think that's also fascinating that there is one, you know, like and that we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot on
Sorry.
Oh yeah, there's just a lot on the earlier conversation that I'm gonna be thinking about, and will be interesting with Bova's presentation, and then what Dennis and I are talking about category theory to kind of tease out some of this in the mathematics. And I think I'll want to come back down the road in this series on the representation questions, because I think there's a lot there. But I wanted to just actually also add a answer to Michael's question about how this kind of applies in the States. And I'd agree first off with Allan's general point that there's not, besides, the just a vast amount of destructive capacity and that being president of the United States gives you, there's not necessarily that much that's interesting about Trump's movement per se compared to many of the other ones at play right now. But I think that one thing that really struck me in terms of going back to the perspective question and how so much of that could only be accounted for in terms of these constructed devices. When you watch the Trump administration, fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and go after a lot of the internal intelligence community, like for example with the interpretations around the bombing of the Iran nuclear facilities, the targeting of financial analyses that confirm inflation, et cetera, that we're seeing like an actual attack on those constructed introspective devices that without which you cannot see these like distorted pieces of economic or geopolitical or, even, I'm sure we'll see in terms of polling, even really realistically, like this idiotic conversation about Bad Bunny playing the Super Bowl and some of the claims about, oh, this country music star represents contemporary American pop culture, which is just completely obviously not the case. But like there's been an increasing which was actually not true of even the Bush years, like the music represented something. It like captured something more introspective about the base. So I think that there's an interesting kind of reliance upon a lot of the fetishistic mechanisms that you talk about as you break down the like social positions to introspect, and you can no longer rely upon the usefulness of the state in terms of its capacity to render things legible, and you end up falling back more and more on this fetishization of, and I think those three circles that you have in the diagrams about the way that the state, the people, and what is deemed as enemy, is really what like the No Kings rally is about, versus the Trump discourse at the moment is precisely trying to define which of those circles is kind of hegemonic at the moment. So I think that'll be a useful framework. I'm even thinking about in terms of talking about to some of the people I'm organizing with inside the United States. I think that diagram could be really useful to try to help clarify the moment.
This is
So
really
yeah,
interesting because I haven't thought about this, but yeah, in a certain way, because what I was saying, like the fact that the state needs to make things legible to itself means that it also needs to make it legible for potentially anyone. So like a map, like the fact that the state is mapping out something or putting, like signs, or like in a subway map or something, saying like this is called like this is called that, this is address like Wall Street 47. Like that means that anyone can go there and figure out the logic and go to Wall Street 47. You kind of like you need to generalize it for everyone. And this might be a problem if you're trying to kind of like Trump is trying to make reality less legible. But in order for it to make it less legible for everyone, he needs to make it less legible for the state itself. So like it's a paradox, but I think uh it's an interesting thing that appears in this theory. It appears directly in James Scott. This idea that the state kind of like makes it legible for the state, for the state official that can come from anywhere, but that it makes legible for anyone. And this is the good side of legibility in his own account. And he's kind of against the state in general. It's kind of like classic anarchist theory. Uh, but like it's like, yeah, I like the being able to go to a different city and use the subway because I can read, basic signs. And it also like so make the city legible means make it legible for anyone. And so maybe a form of kind of like grabbing power and eclipsing things and helping that process of like accumulating power is precisely to make it less legible for the state, because then you rely more on your own personal capacities. Yeah, this is an interesting thing. I didn't think about it,
I
but
think I'd
yeah.
add just one more thing to that analysis, because if you then look like specifically at the way that Trump is going after the Fed, you could also argue that there's another dimension um, of the federal going after the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. You could say that there's another dimension of legibility because so much what the Federal Reserve and the kind of institutions around that do is not so much, I think, render legible for everybody, but do render legible for capitalists. So there's like a class dimension too. There's like the level of like legibility, like you're talking about, which is also true when we see the attacks on science and like climate response and meteorology and stuff, where it is legibility for everyone. But when we're also looking at the way that capitalism makes sense of its reality to itself, even in a way that's very exclusive to everyone else, even those institutions are being pushed upon. So you see like a level of like specific bourgeois kind of class pushback to Trump around their capacity to do business on top of a larger kind of popular pushback due to like the breakdown of basic infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of different levels, but yeah, there's kind of like different ways that in order to make things legible, there are different kind of sectors of society that then also gain legibility in that process for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what John said before I read Thomas' question. I think actually he left already, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, but it's just that uh, one thing that I was wondering, that if especially with the way you framed the problem when we were talking about like ways that Karatani can be read and the issue of this kind of logical scaffolding versus the logic of the state being more complex. It feels to me that another thing we could use here, that I think the way we were discussing images of nation, for example, already implies here on the chat, right? Is just subsumption as a really important concept for like accounting for these mixtures, because I think one thing that's becoming clearer and clearer as we move along with this theory is that, Marx's theory of formal and real subsumption is actually a theory of how logics overcode one another or not, right? Formal subsumption would be the first reading of Karatani. Locally, mode A is dominant. Globally, mode B is dominant. And then you said, yeah, but aren't these logics changed from within once they are inscribed in this statehood logic? That's real subsumption. It's not just an overcoding in the sense of some additional layer that they need to externally respect, but it's already a reshaping of the logic of mode A insofar as it's now dominated by this other thing, right? So it feels like that's a very relevant operation to account in this theory because it could give rise to nuance in how these things operate. Because one thing is to say, well, the logic of the state is just limiting the scope of mode A. Another thing is to say that it's reshaping. It can even have a bigger impact. It's now, let's say, just a means for the propagation of mode B itself. So perspective as a grammar is no longer external to the logic of this monopoly of perspective, but it's how it propagates itself. So there might be just a way of accounting for this in terms of it's the real subsumption of one thing under the other. And I just gave the example. I think that this is relevant from the images that we were talking about because, for example, the Delacroix image of liberty leading the people, it's very good real subsumption of mode A under mode B because you have Leviathan amongst the people. You have like this entity, which is not a person, which is freedom, amongst real people. So it's one of us. It's one of the pack, like a leader, right? But it's not one of the pack because it's actually a transcendent concept. So that's already a real subsumption of something which is mode A, where you should be able to have mutual reciprocal recognition. But there, inside of that recognition, which is symmetric and kind of immanent, you actually have an exception, right? So it does feel in some way that this kind of distinction between forms of subsumption of things, parts and wholes and so on would be relevant. The other thing I just wanted to bring up, two other points that I think we've touched upon when distinguishing logics and trying to frame the role of and the specificity of statehood. One is that, I think this is something I thought about while talking to you, Allan, and I've never really managed to flesh it out further. But I think that one of the reasons why there are certain images for the totality of the state, but there aren't so clearly for mode A and mode C, perhaps, is that fetishism is also being modulated by these logics. And one of the intuitions that I had for a while is that, when you fetishize mode A, when you try to see this logic as an autonomous thing, you actually reify, let's say, the relations between people appear as relations between relations. Because relation is the thing that survives as the form-giving thing, which is not fully true as well. It is a fetishization, but it's very different than a fetishization in capital, where relations between people appear as relations between things, as objects. So objecthood gets let's say, totality becomes a totality of objects in capitalism. And like, if you want to see the type of picture you get, you can look at things like Carl Sagan talking about pale blue dot. This kind of look at this. It's not looking at us. It's look at this place we're inhabiting. It's like the only thing that can kind of give it an envelope. It's actually the lowest common denominator, right? We're all on this piece of rock. That's the common denominator. That's how you get to a totality, because objecthood is the thing that gets kind of privileged when you reify things under value. I think what you're very, very convincingly showing is that, but fetishization with the state gives actually the subject that position. When you reify things at the level of the state, everything becomes a subject. The state is a subject for subjects, and you get this whole dynamic, which is also reification and fetishization, right? So you would have like in the subject relation to an object kind of structure, you would either reify the subject or the relation or the object, depending on the mode. Those things are, let's say, the thing that gives some sort of cognitive support to this totality somehow. I think that there is something to this that is useful, like in the image liberty leading the people, it's the leading that is reified under mode A. Like it's a relation of freedom to the people, right? In the state is more the Leviathan, is the subject. There is a bigger subject than individual subject. And in capital, it's neither of these two things. People don't have relations, and there is no subject that we make up. There's just a lot of objects that either mediate our connections or that we are when you consider ourselves as a totality. And I think that this connects with another. So I wanted to see if you think that that's still a good direction to go. But then there's another aspect to it that I think it's also relevant to yeah, but a vote is a relation between subjects, right? A vote is not a relation between objects. I think that's important. That's why it's a state mechanism. Capital doesn't care about votes, right? Because we know you can vote for whoever you want. Money will decide who has the power because it's how something else pushes and pulls for capitalist power, right? But I think that there's also the other kind of thing we've developed a while and we didn't follow through, which connects to this kind of distinctions, which is this idea that, and again, the statehood aspect of it is perhaps the most kind of interesting, which is there is kind of an inversion, a clear inversion between kind of the cosmos and history. Because the idea of a cosmic kind of totality, it's very paraconsistent. Everything fits in it, including itself. And it's kind of closed, but it allows for inconsistency, right? So it's complete. There's nothing outside of the cosmos, but there is no consistency. You can have inconsistent, people can be in two places at once, right? That's a mode A totality. Mode C, it's more the inverse. You have consistency, but you don't have completeness. Things are consistent, but they're open-ended, like history. That's how we see totality for ourselves, right? We understand capitalist totality as an open one. That's why it's hard to totalize it in the sense of what's the name of this thing, right? It's the next thing that's going to name the previous thing somehow, right? But state totality is somewhere in the middle because, I mean, it's the realm of totalities that are kind of complete and consistent, but because that they are weak. Like there are eras, there are dynasties, there are, kind of particular governments. They have a hierarchy, they manage to order everything. And as I said, with no gaps in a consistent way. But the price to pay is that they cannot be, let's say, they remain to be seen from somewhere else because they cannot be everywhere. They cannot be a full totality in that sense, right?
You know that this consistency, completeness thing, like, and at some point in my dissertation, I say that the way that power and rights or power and law are connected is that power is complete but inconsistent because like it exists in a certain context. So like the power is here, but it's not necessarily consistent. At the same time, consistency is what defines law, but then law is inherently incomplete because it can never justify itself. It can never like found its own principles in its own workings. That it goes all like to all the paradoxes. Yeah. So like the fact that you have, as you said, like mode A is complete but inconsistent. Mode C is consistent but incomplete. And then in mode B, you have like the encounter of the two. But then it again, like it's like that drawing that you did. Like you have mode A, you have mode B, mode C, and then you have mode B. But then mode B is actually mode A and mode C again. Like kind of like, and it becomes like this because it's a paradox of even how to talk about it, right? Because like when we're talking about it, we follow necessarily some kind of classical logic of like either or, like like when you're doing your drawings, you're always doing the X, like this is different from that, this is different from that, which is like classical logic, but then necessarily it kind of like gets undermined by the own problem. Then you start to become paraconsistent yourself, but it's kind of like mode B organizes how we think in a very fundamental way. Like both because of classical logic, but also because of the state organizes reality in fundamental way.
Yeah, but you know, like this is how I was. Well, that's why I said the thing about subsumption, because I like there seems to me to be a profound distinction between there's a very important difference between uh, say we adopt this idea that you can, when you have a cut, the limit can be with the lower part, in the sense that we set up this cut, we empowered you to be different from us, versus yeah, but you know, I have the power. From my perspective, you guys have no way of ruling yourselves. You're outside of this limit, right? Uh, and now you have this. It can go both ways, and then there is the issue of, well, can you use mode A logic or mode C logic to navigate this duality, right? Uh, there is a big difference between using mode A and mode C to navigate that duality, using the state to navigate the tension between mode A and mode C, meaning at some point communities are coming into contact through commerce and there are tensions, and establishing the law for everyone will reduce that tension. Those two processes are different, right? Reintroducing mode A because you want to reinforce the dominant community's internal power structure and separate it even further from the dominated communities, right? And use commerce to make that work. It's different from bringing the state secondarily, right? So those two logics need to be distinguished, even though the state does seem to play a similar role of mediating. In one case, let's say the tension is introduced by the state and the other logics are harmonizing it. In the other case, the tension was introduced by the other logics and the state is harmonizing them a bit, right? That seems different to me somehow. But
both are right.
Yeah,
Really.
I think those would be different historical contexts, right? You would get these two things. Probably you even get this weird reiteration because you have communities, commerce brings them together. You have some laws to mediate their relations, but this reintroduces the problem of, okay, you introduced the law to mediate, but how did you do it? Like, where is this limit? And now you need to account for that limit and so on and so forth, right? Like there's something that feels also understudied in all of this, which is the kind of perpetual disequilibrium of the state, in the sense that every time the state solves a problem, it produces something limitless. Every time it orders something, it produces something internally that is disordered, right? I think that also what Dennis mentioned with this movie, I wasn't very clear on how external to mode B it looked, because, you know, this idea that bureaucracy is so heavy on the state, like the state needs to account for its own means of accounting for things, and that's a whole new domain of concern, right? Like, I want to rule over some people, I need to send them some people there, and now I need to have rules over the people who rule, and there is just this inherent excess that's very connected to this underlying asymmetry of how cuts are made, right? So it just feels like a mise en abyme, where if the state harmonizes something between communities and commodities, it will need communities and commodities to harmonize its own problems. So you would get both, as you said, but they are nevertheless something distinct to account. Which is really cool. Michael, you had a question too, didn't you? Like, you wrote a bunch here.
I don't know if it's a question. I'm just trying to think while I listen to the discussion, but I don't know. I really think I should research a little bit more about this concept of person in anthropology and in Strathern.
I think Strathern is fascinating. I think everyone should try to read it, or at least read Alfred Gell's Strathernograms, which is 30 pages, and it's great. And it's very helps a lot to understand what she's doing in that book. But the thing about like person and subject I always struggle with is that I don't see much I don't see much difference. I mean like probably there is a difference between person and subject, one that matters, and Gabriel once tried to explain like a difference. And I think that, you know, like the fact perhaps like psychoanalysis is relevant because, you know, the notion of the subject is completely different from the notion of the person. But the language that Hobbes uses, for instance, is both. Like he uses person and subject kind of indistinctly. And even when you talk about like juridical persons or legal persons or personhood in a juridical sense, like person is like the opposite of thing, of so like of property or anything. So like I always struggle with the concept, although I can accept it. You know, like I can say like yes, like mode A has like a person form, mode C has a commodity form, and then mode B like a subject form. I don't know, maybe yeah.
Yeah, for example, you can say that something is not like you build a car and it's not under regulation. It's subject to a law, the car. Like there is some security safety measures every car needs to abide to. And you can say this about services, you can say this about how you handle property that you own and things like this. You're subject to some rules, right? It doesn't feel to me that personhood is established in that regard.
No,
Personhood,
that's yeah, but this is a notion of subjectivity that is based on subjection. But
but
the
yeah,
notion of the subject is not just reduced to subjection.
but I think subjection is just one side of it because I mean, if you get like from French tradition, what makes the subject a cool topic that everyone used to like to some degree is that it's on the two sides of the rule. It's the thing that makes up a rule and the things that follows a rule. That's why it's a divided subject for psychoanalysis, right? Being entangled with the rule in that regard, in a way that is actually breaks away from how you see yourself and you're seen by others, right? I might have a lot of dignity or honor in the face of other people due to my actions and my reactions and reciprocity and blah blah blah. But I might be behaving outside of the law. So in the sense I'm subjected to something. So I'm implicated. I think it's more of a mode of implication that will divide you between maker and follower of a rule, right? Who sets up a limit? I think that's of what's, let's say, legitimate and what's not. I think that's what's at stake with subjectivity versus like, do you have interiority or not? And is your interiority capable of dividing what's interior in other things? That's the issue of personhood. Personhood is about soul and body. Like, do you have a soul? Like, and to have a soul is, are you a place from which I can be seen? To have a body and a soul as well. That's the kind of mirroring infinity of personhood, right? Versus, are you implicate, like let's say, are you implicated in what counts as lawful behavior and what doesn't? You can be the maker of those rules, you can be the follower of those rules, but those two things don't need to coincide. Like I watched Elephant Man, the David Lynch movie recently, which has this very famous line, like I'm a human being, you know, that the guy who's totally disfigured cries. And it's the best movie about personhood I've ever seen because it's about this guy who's totally deformed. He was a circus attraction. A doctor takes care of him, but again, as a kind of medical example of a problem, and he slowly becomes humanized. And to become humanized means that his perspective on other characters starts to matter for other characters, like their goodness or morality is meaningfully evaluated from the standpoint of that character, and that's how he acquires a soul in the light of other people. That's a totally orthogonal axis to the issue of subject, I think, because usually, let's say, the minimal operation of subjectivity beyond the law, classic, like official law, is are you responsible for your actions? Meaning, regardless of whether you wanted to do it or not, regardless of whether it speaks to you as a person or not, you did this. Are you willing to accept the consequences or not, right? That's, let's say, why Kant is not worried about personhood. He's worried about the subject in that sense. That's why analysts love him. Like, it becomes clear that a different idea of respect, a different idea of lawfulness, a different idea of, which is totally orthogonal to honor or to dignity, appears when you need to follow through with your actions and to be the subject of your actions, even if that kind of tears you away from how you're socially seen in your community, right?
I like more the first half. The second half, I think that is because, in the first half of your argument, you could just say like a capital can be a subject,
Yes.
the alien spirit can be a subject because it has like this relationship with us, with a law, with a rule. But when it becomes like attribution of responsibility, I think that like a clear, like I agree with you, and I love the explanation, and I think that we can stick with it for sure. But for instance, like in Roman law, this what you just said is the definition of persona. So like it's someone that can be like whose actions can be attributed to and can be like responsible for the action. So it becomes like a language problem then.
No, but I think I mean, we could historicize this with the fact that for very long, the establishment of the state was didn't manage to fully. I mean, it's very likely that only with the hegemony of labor power as this totally depersonalizing force did the state manage to come up with a juridical figure that is, clearly distinguished from the individual person, like to the degree that it is today. I imagine that most societies, when they want to talk about this instance of implication, they wouldn't, for example, be so willing to give the position of subject to a corporation, but the fact that this detached itself to the point that we can say corporations are liable, corporations are subject to this and that, like it's because we managed to, and we wouldn't call them persons, like we would in a very, very like PJ juridical person, but that's
Yeah, in the juridical sense, they are persons, and this is not even polemic.
yeah, but
You
again,
see, like,
but I don't think, I mean, I have no problem with let's just call it like mode A has the name A and not person, B has the name B, and mode C has the name C. I don't care about the name, but like
yeah.
whatever we're calling person, to me, has more to do with the fact that when that thing is a person, it has a perspective that also divides you in the sense that you'll be redistributed. Which part of you is a body, which part of you is also a point of view, right?
So in my presentation, like the fact that the state is a subject is not polemic, but that the state is a person in the way that I articulated, then it's more polemic.
Yes, I'd say that like once you have the monopoly of perspectives, you have a dehumanizing kind of force for both sides. So, the same reason why the police are entitled not to give part of the population the dignity of being a person is what also dehumanizes the police. The game of reciprocity of perspectives is broken, and that affects both, right? So I feel like there's a part of your presentation which is also a genesis of how you can move from persons to subjects. Of course, again, we will go back to that problem because then real subsumption of the community under the state will resignify the person, right? And we will start recognizing as persons only those persons who are overcoded by the subject, something like this, right? So if you're a person who doesn't give a shit about the state, if you're part of an indigenous population that just kind of tears agreements and says, fuck you, right? You're a person, but not in our sense of juridical person, because juridical person is already kind of a mixed binomial, which under what we're saying really is we're only gonna allow in the game of reciprocal perspectives those perspectives that recognize the centrality of property, something like this, right? So I mean, I think we can reach a point where the use of person in the juridical language is understandable, but we should probably start from a more stark division between personhood as this interplay of, I mean, what in value theory is the sensible and super sensible part of the commodity, which is use and exchange value, at the level of persons is body and soul, right? Value is the soul, use value is the body, something like this. And
And
they
in
are
the
also,
level of the subject,
I think it's law giving law, like it's this double
ruler
aspect.
and ruled.
Yeah. And you can constrict this to varying degrees. Like if now the game of personhood needs to be played inside of the game of statehood. Now we're going to look at how the logic of rulers and ruled constrains the logic of body and soul. And you get a very classic figure of nature and culture where, to have a soul is to rule. And if you're on the side of the ruled, the manipulated, whatever, you don't have a soul. And you would get like something recognizable, I don't know who, Descartes or whatever, right? And now if you even play this game inside of the use and exchange value logic, and then it constrains the rules and ruled, and it constrains the body and soul dynamic, like you would probably get something very recognizable as well, I think. But it's useful to have some degree of separation between those things to then bring them together, I think. Like just to give an example sorry guys, I'm ranting so much, but I just read a paper by this really cool anthropologist, a Brazilian guy, very young guy also, Lucas. I'm not sure if you know him. He's a Marxist anthropologist.
Lucas Pereira Alves.
I think so. Yeah.
Barreira.
Yeah. I read.
Yeah, he's my friend. Like
yeah, man. I asked him for a recent paper he wrote on bargain. Have you seen this
Yeah,
one?
it's his dissertation. I haven't read it.
Man, it's amazing, and it's a really
It's
good.
brilliant, yeah.
It's really brilliant, and I think one of the core insights that he has is that he's studying how mode A and mode C relate in a different context, which is not so mediated by the state, because he shows that you can have pacts with supernatural entities that are of the form of, the gift, like sacrifices, things like this, but you can have bargains with these entities. And bargains are totally different. They're very mode C. Like, it's like, I'll give you a bit, let me see what you give me back, and we'll see if, we're negotiating. And it's a really good example of how you can have personhood established, and then you can have, a commodity exchange of equivalents amongst these persons of such heterogeneous nature as this guy in San Francisco and this entity, So I think it just goes to show that it's good to distinguish these things. Like, the text is really good. I'll just post it here if anyone wants.
He just became professor in Olinda.
Ah, that's amazing.
Yeah, I translated some of his stuff to English. Like we know each other for like a very long time.
That's amazing.
I really needed to use the restroom. Are we going
I
on
think
for...
I'm not sure if anyone else has questions.
There is Tomas' question, but I can answer him in private. But I know him, so
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think your bathroom break has priority.
Mhm.
So we're meeting again already next week. Is the next presentation?
Yes, exactly.
It's Mo's presentation next week. Okay.
Yeah.
Then Monica's, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't be here next week, but I'll be in the following one.
Cool. Great.
But I'll see if I can watch the recording. For
Yeah,
sure.
we recorded today. This is a victory. So yeah. Okay.
To help the legibility of things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the legibility was maintained.
Through an apparatus.
Okay, guys.
Okay. Thank you so much, Allan and everybody. and see you next week.
See you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you all.